Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to discuss how the United States came to acquire two of its largest states, Texas, and there is another one.
Mr. Green, I believe the answer you're looking for is Alaska.
Oh, me from the past. As you can clearly tell from the globe, Alaskan statehood never happened. No, I am referring, of course, to California. Dan, are we using your computer today?
Oh, Stan!
We've talked about westward expansion a few times here on Crash Course, but it's usually about, like, Kentucky or Ohio. This time we're going really west. I mean, not like Hawaii west, but sea to shining sea west. So you might remember that journalist John O. Sullivan coined the phrase manifest destiny to describe America's God-given right to take over all the land between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, regardless of who happened to be living there. Sorry, Native Americans, Mexicans, French fur trappers, beavers, bison, prairie dogs, passenger pigeons. I'm not going to go so far as to give God credit for America's internal imperialism, but I will say that our expansion had a lot to do with economics, especially when you consider Jefferson's ideas about the Empire of Liberty. Dan, did I just say liberty? That means technically I also have to talk about slavery, but we're going to kick the slavery can down the road until later in the show, just like American politicians did in the 19th century. By 1860, nearly 300,000 people had made the trip that has since been immortalized by the classic educational video game Oregon Trail, which, by the way, is inaccurate in the sense that a family of 6, even a very hungry one, cannot eat a buffalo, but is extremely accurate in that a lot of people died of dysentery and cholera. Frickin' disease. So Oregon at the time was jointly controlled by the U.S. and Britain. Northern Mexico at the time included what are now Texas, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, New Mexico, and California. But New Mexico and California were the only two with, like, big settlements. About 30,000 Mexicans lived in New Mexico and about 3,500 in California. And in both places, they were outnumbered by Native Americans. Okay, let's go to the thought bubble. When Mexico became independent, there were only about 2,000 Tejanos there. So to encourage economic development, Mexico's government granted a huge tract of land to Moses Austin. Austin's son Stephen made a tidy profit selling off smaller parcels of that land until there were 7,000 Americans there. This made Mexico nervous, so backpedaling furiously, Mexico annulled the land contracts and banned further emigration into Texas. Even though slavery was already abolished in Mexico, up to now they had allowed Americans to bring slaves. Austin, joined by some Tejano elites, demanded greater autonomy and the right to use slave labor. Thinking the better of it, Mexican General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna decided to assert control over the rest of territory with an army, turning the elite's demands for autonomy into a full-scale revolt for independence. On March 13, 1836, Santa Anna defeated the American defenders of the Alamo, killing 187, or 188, sources differ, Americans, including Davy Crockett. The Texas rebels would remember the Alamo and come back to defeat Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto, and Mexico was forced to recognize Texas's independence. So Texas became the Lone Star Republic and quickly decided that it would be much better to be a less lonely star and join the United States. So in 1837, Texas's Congress called for union, but all they heard back was, "Not so fast, Texas." Why? Because Texas wanted to be a slave state, and adding another slave state would disrupt the balance in the Senate. So Jackson and Van Buren did what good politicians always do. They ignored Texas. And then, after Martin Van Buren wrote a letter denouncing any plan to annex Texas on the grounds that it would probably provoke a war, Democratic Convention Southerners threw their support behind slave-holding Andrew Jackson pal, James K. Polk. Polk just managed to get a presidential victory over perennial almost President Henry Clay, and seeing the writing on the wall, Congress annexed Texas in March of 1845, days before Polk took office. Congress then forged an agreement with Britain to divide Oregon at the 49th parallel, which restored the slave state-free state balance in the Senate. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Hey, Stan, can I get the foreshadowing filter? I wonder if we're going to be able to keep that slave state-free state balance forever. The land-hungry James K. Polk had another goal as president: acquire California from Mexico. He tried to purchase it from Mexico, but they were like, no, which is Spanish for no. So Polk decided to do things the hard way. He sent troops under future President Zachary Taylor into this disputed border region. As expected, by which I mean intended, fighting broke out between American and Mexican forces. Polk, in calling for a declaration of war, claimed that the Mexicans had, quote, shed blood upon American soil, although the soil in question was arguably not American. American, unless you think of America as being, all of this. A majority of Americans supported this war, although to be fair, a majority of Americans will support almost any war. I'm sorry, but it is true. At least at first. It was the first war fought by American troops primarily on foreign soil, as most of the fighting was done in Mexico. Among the dissenters was a Massachusetts transcendentalist who is probably better known than the war itself. Henry David Thoreau was in fact thrown in jail for refusing to pay taxes in protest of the war, and wrote On Civil Disobedience in his defense, which many American high schoolers are assigned to read and expected not to understand, lest they take the message to heart and stop doing assignments like reading on civil disobedience. Another critic was concerned about the increase in executive power that Polk seemed to show, saying, "Allow the president to invade a neighboring country whenever he shall deem it necessary to repel an invasion, and you allow him to make war at pleasure." That critic was none other than noted peacenik Abraham Lincoln, who would go on to do more to expand executive power than any president in the 19th century, except maybe Andrew Jackson. Right, so Santa Anna's army was defeated in February 1847, but Mexico refused to give up, so Winfield Scott, who had the unfortunate nickname Old Fuss and Feathers, captured Mexico City itself in September. A final peace treaty, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, was signed in 1848, under which Mexico confirmed the annexation of Texas and further ceded California, as well as several other places that would later become states, but we couldn't fit on the map. In return, the U.S. paid Mexico $15 million and agreed to a no-backsies deal in Reed, Texas, thereby freeing Mexico from the shackles of Amarillo. I'm sorry, Amarillans. No, I'm not. I am. I'm not. I am. This is great, Stan. The people of Amarillo hate me, also the people of New Jersey. Alaska is in the green parts of not America. We don't even have Arizona and New Mexico on the chalkboard. Pretty soon, I will have alienated everyone. Anyway, thanks to the land from Mexico, our dream of expanding from the Atlantic to the Pacific was finally complete, and as always happens when dreams come true, trouble started. After the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, between 75,000 and 100,000 Spanish-speaking Mexicans and 150,000 Native Americans were under the jurisdiction of the United States. Despite the fact that the treaty granted Spanish-descended Mexican male citizens legal and property rights, the Mexicans were still seen as inferior to Anglo-Saxons, whose manifest destiny it was, of course, to overspread the continent. And the fact that these Mexicans were Catholic didn't help either, especially because in the eastern part of the United States there was a rising tide of anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant sentiment known as nativism. And there was a new political party, the American Party, dedicated entirely to such sentiment. They were referred to as the Know-Nothings, because when you asked them about their politics, they would answer that they didn't know anything. And indeed, they didn't. This was not an expert branding strategy, although they did manage to win an unexpected number of local offices in a state heralded for its ignorance. Massachusetts. You thought I was going to say New Jersey, but I'm trying to make nice with the New Jersey people because they take it pretty personally. Meanwhile, in California, there weren't enough white English-speaking American residents to apply for statehood until gold was discovered in 1848, leading, of course, to San Francisco's NFL team, the San Francisco 48ers. By 1852, the non-Indian population in California had risen from 15,000 to 200,000, and it was 360,000 on the eve of the Civil War. Now, not all of those migrants, mainly young men seeking their fortunes, were white. Nearly 25,000 Chinese people migrated to California, most as contract workers working for mining and railroad companies. And there were women, too, who ran restaurants and worked as cooks and laundresses and prostitutes, but the ratio of men to women in California in 1860 was 3 to 1. Ah, schmirg. It's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. I read the mystery document and I'm either shocked by electricity or by the fact that I got it right. We would beg to remind you that when your nation was a wilderness and the nation from which you sprung barbarous, we exercised most of the arts and virtues of civilized life, that we are possessed of a language and a literature, and that men skilled in science and the arts are numerous among us, that the productions of our manufactories, our sale and workshops form no small share of commerce of the world, and that for centuries colleges, schools, charitable institutions, asylums, and hospitals have been as common as in your own land. And we beg to remark that so far as the history of our race in California goes, it stamps with the test of truth that we are not the degraded race you would make us. So it's someone who said we had a great civilization when you were a wilderness, plus they called us barbarous, so it's either ancient Rome or China. I'm gonna lean toward China. That only gets me halfway there. Now I have to think of the name of the person, and I don't know any famous people from mid-19th century China who lived in the US. People say I can't sing. Norman Ossing? Who the hell is Norman Ossing? So these days, California is known for its groovy, laid-back, oh, your back hurts, here's some pot attitude. But that was not the case in the 19th century. The California Constitution of 1850 limited civil participation to whites. No Asians, no black people, or Native Americans could vote or testify in court. Indians were kicked off their land if it had any mineral value, and thousands of their orphan children were sold as slaves. And all of this led to the Indian population of California dropping from 150,000 to about 30,000 between 1848 and 1860. So it wasn't at all clear whether California was the kind of place to be admitted to the U.S. as a free state or as a slave state. The Missouri Compromise was of no help here because half of California is below the 3630 line and half is above it. So a new Free Soil Party formed in 1848 calling for the limiting of slavery's expansion in the West so that it could be open for white people to live and work. I just want to be clear that most of the people who were for limiting slavery were not, like, unracist. So they nominated the admirably whiskered Martin Van Buren for the presidency, and Van Buren and Democratic nominee Lewis Cass then split the northern vote, allowing the aforementioned Zachary Taylor to win. So in 1850, when California finally did ask to be admitted into the Union, it was as a free state. Southerners freaked out because they saw it as the beginning of the end of slavery, but then, to the rescue came Henry Clay for his last hurrah. He said, "We can kick this problem down the road once more," and brokered a four-part plan that became known rather anticlimactically as the Compromise of 1850. Historians, can you name nothing? The 4 points were: 1, California would be admitted as a free state; 2, the slave trade, but not slavery, would be outlawed in Washington, D.C.; 3, a new super harsh fugitive slave law would be enacted; and 4, popular sovereignty. The idea was that in the remaining territories taken from Mexico, the local white inhabitants could decide for themselves whether the state would be slave or free when it applied to be part of the United States. Ah, the Compromise of 1850, a great reminder that nothing protects the rights of minorities like the tyranny of the majority. There was a huge debate over the bill in which noted asshat John C. Calhoun was so sick that he had to have his pro-slavery, anti-compromise remarks read by a colleague. On the other side, New York Senator William Seward, an abolitionist, also argued against compromise based on slavery being, wrong. But eventually, the compromise did pass, thus averting a greater crisis for 10 whole years. Ralph Waldo Emerson predicted that if the United States acquired part of Mexico, it would be like swallowing arsenic. And indeed, arsenic can be a slow-acting poison. Now, I don't think Ralph Waldo Emerson was a good enough writer to have thought that far ahead, but he was right. Some people say that Manifest Destiny made the Civil War inevitable, but as we'll see next week, what really made the Civil War inevitable was slavery. But we see in the story of Manifest Destiny the underlying problem. The United States didn't govern according to its own ideals. It didn't extend liberties to Native Americans or Mexican Americans or immigrant populations or slaves. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week, when things will get much worse. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller. Our script supervisor is Meredith Danko. The show is written by my high school history teacher Raoul Meyer and myself. Our associate producer is Danica Johnson, and our graphics team is Thought Cafe. If you'd like to contribute to the Libertage, you can suggest captions. You can also ask questions in comments where they will be answered by our team of historians. Thank you for watching Crash Course, and as we say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome. Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we discuss one of the most confusing questions in American history. What caused the Civil War? Just kidding, it's not a confusing question at all. Slavery caused the Civil War. Mr. Green, but what about like states' rights and nationalism, economics? Me from the past, your senior year of high school, you will be taught American government by Mr. Fleming, a white Southerner who will seem to you to be about 182 years old, and you will say something to him in class about states' rights, and Mr. Fleming will turn to you and he will say, "A state's right to what, sir?" And for the first time in your snotty little life, you will be well and truly speechless. The road to the Civil War leads to discussions of states' rights, to slavery, and differing economic systems, specifically whether those economic systems should involve slavery, and the election of Abraham Lincoln, specifically how his election impacted slavery, but none of those things would have been issues without slavery. So let's pick up with the most controversial section of the Compromise of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Law. Now, longtime Crash Course viewers will remember that there was already a fugitive slave law written into the United States Constitution. So what made this one so controversial? Under Under this new law, any citizen was required to turn in anyone he or she knew to be a slave to authorities, and that made like every person in New England into a sheriff, and it also required them to enforce a law they found abhorrent. So they had to be sheriffs, and they didn't even get little gold badges. Thought Bubble, can I have a gold badge? Oh. Awesome, thank you. This law was also terrifying to people of color in the North because even if you'd, say, been born free in Massachusetts, the courts could send you into slavery if even one person swore before a judge that you were a specific slave. And many people of color responded to the fugitive slave law by moving to Canada, which at the time was still technically an English colony, thereby further problematizing the whole idea that England was all about tyranny and the United States was all about freedom. But anyway, the most important result of the fugitive slave law was that it convinced some Northerners that the government was in the hands of a sinister slave power. Sadly, slave power was not a heavy metal band or Britney Spears' new single or even a secret cabal of powerful slaves, but rather a conspiracy theory about a secret cabal of pro-slavery congressmen. That conspiracy theory is going to grow in importance, but before we get to that, let us discuss railroads. Underrated in Monopoly and underrated in the Civil War. Let's go to the thought bubble. Railroads made shipping cheaper and more efficient and allowed people to move around the country quickly, and they had a huge backer, also a tiny backer, in the form of Illinois Congressman Stephen Douglas, who wanted a transcontinental railroad because, one, he felt it would bind the Union together at a time when it could use some binding, and two, he figured it would go through Illinois, which would be good for his home state. But there was a problem. To build a railroad, the territory through which it ran needed to be organized, ideally as states, and if the railroad was going to run through Illinois, then the Kansas and Nebraska territories would need to become state-like, so Douglas pushed forward the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. The Kansas-Nebraska Act formalized the idea of popular sovereignty, which basically meant that white residents of states could decide for themselves whether the state should allow slavery. Douglas felt this was a nice way of avoiding saying whether he favored slavery. Instead, he could just be in favor of letting other people be in favor of it. Now, you'll remember that the previously bartered Missouri Compromise banned slavery in new states north of this here line, and since in theory Kansas or Nebraska could have slavery if people there decided they wanted it under the Kansas-Nebraska Act, despite being north of that there line, this in practice repealed the Missouri Compromise. As a result, there was quite a lot of violence in Kansas, so much so that some people say the Civil War really started there in 1857. Also, the Kansas-Nebraska Act led to the creation of a new political party. The Republicans. Yes, those Republicans. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So Douglas's law helped to create a new coalition party dedicated to stopping the extension of slavery. It was made of former Free Soilers, Northern anti-slavery Whigs, and some know-nothings. It was also a completely sectional party, meaning that it drew supporters almost exclusively from the free states in the North and West, which, you'll remember from like 2 minutes ago, were tied together by common economic interests and the railroad. I'm telling you, don't underestimate railroads. By the way, we are getting to you, Dred Scott. And now we return at last to slave power. For many Northerners, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which repealed the Missouri Compromise, was yet more evidence that Congress was controlled by a sinister slave power group doing the bidding of rich plantation owners, which, as conspiracy theories go, wasn't the most far-fetched. In fact, by 1854, the North was far more populous than the South. It had almost doubled the South's congressional representation, but in spite of this advantage, Congress had just passed a law extending the power of slave states and potentially, because 2 new states meant 4 new senators, making the federal government even more pro-slavery. And to abolitionists, that didn't really seem like democracy. The other reason that many Northerners cared enough about Kansas and Nebraska to abandon their old party loyalties was that having them become slave states was seen as a threat to Northerners' economic self-interest. Remember, the West was seen as a place where individuals, specifically white individuals, could become self-sufficient farmers. As Lincoln wrote, "The whole nation is interested that the best use be made of these territories. We want them to be the homes of free white people. They cannot be to any considerable extent if slavery is planted within them. New free states are places for poor people to go to and better their condition." So the real question was, would these western territories have big slave-based plantations like happened in Mississippi, or small family farms full of frolicking free white people like happened in Thomas Jefferson's imagination? So the new Republican Party ran its first presidential candidate in 1856 and did remarkably well. John C. Fremont from California picked up 39% of the vote, all of it from the North and West, and lost to the Democrat James Buchanan, who had the virtue of having spent most of the previous decade in Europe and thus not having a position on slavery. I mean, let me take this opportunity to remind you that James Buchanan's nickname was the Old Public Functionary. Meanwhile, Kansas was trying to become a state by holding elections in 1854 and 1855. I say trying because these elections were so fraudulent that they would be funny, except that everything stops being funny like 12 years before the Civil War, and it doesn't get really funny again until Charlie Chaplin. Ah, Charlie Chaplin, thank you for being in the public domain and giving us a much-needed break from a nation divided against itself, discovering that it cannot stand. Right, so part of the Kansas problem was that hundreds of so-called border ruffians flocked to Kansas from pro-slavery Missouri to cast ballots in Kansas elections, which led to people coming in from free states and setting up their own rival governments. Fighting eventually broke out and more than 200 people were killed. In fact, in 1856, pro-slavery forces laid siege to anti-slavery Lawrence, Kansas with cannons. One particularly violent incident involved the murder of an entire family by an anti-slavery zealot from New York named John Brown. He got away with that murder, but hold on a minute, we'll get to him. Anyway, in the end, Kansas passed 2 constitutions because, you know, that's a good way to get started as a government. The pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution was the first that went to the U.S. Congress, and it was supported by Stephen Douglas as an example of popular sovereignty at work, except that the man who oversaw the voting in Kansas called it a vile fraud. Congress delayed Kansas's entry into the Union, because Congress's primary business is delay, until another more fair referendum took place, and after that vote, Kansas eventually did join the U.S. as a free state in 1861, by which time it was frankly too late. Alright, so while all this craziness was going on in Kansas and Congress, the Supreme Court was busy rendering the worst decision in its history. Oh, hi there, Dred Scott. Dred Scott had been a slave whose master had taken him to live in Illinois and Wisconsin, both of which barred slavery, so Scott sued, arguing that if slavery was illegal in Illinois, then living in Illinois made him definitionally not a slave. The case took years to find its way to the Supreme Court, and eventually in 1857, Chief Justice Roger B. Taney from Maryland handed down his decision. The court held that Scott was still a slave, but it went even further, attempting to settle the slavery issue once and for all. Taney ruled that black people, quote, had for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro must justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. So that is an actual quote from an actual decision by the Supreme Court of the United States of America? Wow. I mean, Taney's ruling basically said that all black people anywhere in the United States could be considered property, and that the court was in the business of protecting that property. This meant that a slave owner could take his slaves from Mississippi to Massachusetts and they would still be slaves, which meant that technically there was no such thing as a free state. At least that's how people in the North, especially Republicans, saw it. The Dred Scott decision helped convince even more people that the entire government, Congress, President Buchanan, and now the Supreme Court were in the hands of the dreaded slave power. Oh, we're gonna do the mystery document now? Stan, I am so confident about today's mystery document that I'm going to write down my guess right now, and then I'm gonna put it in this envelope, and then when I'm right, I want a prize. All I ever get is punishment. I want prizes. Okay, the rules here are simple. I guess the author of the mystery document. I already did that, and then I get rewarded for being right. All right, total confidence. Let's just read this thing, and then I get my reward. I look forward to the days when there shall be a servile insurrection in the South, when the black man shall assert his freedom and wage a war of extermination against his master, when the torch of the incendiary shall light up the towns and cities of the South, and blot out the last vestige of slavery, and though I may not mock at their calamity nor laugh when their fear cometh, yet I will hail it as the dawn of a political millennium. I was right! Right here, guessed in advance, John Brown. What? Stan! Ohio Congressman Joshua Giddings? Seriously, Stan? Whatever, I'm going to talk about John Brown anyway. In 1859, John Brown led a disastrous raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, hoping to capture guns and then give them to slaves who would rise up and use those guns against their masters. But Brown was an awful military commander and not a terribly clear thinker in general, and the raid was an abject failure. Many of the party were killed, and he was captured, he stood trial, and was sentenced to death. Thus, he became a martyr to the abolitionist cause, which is probably what he wanted anyway. On the morning of his hanging, he wrote, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood." Well, he was right about that, but in general, any statement that begins, "I, my name," yeah. And so the stage was set for one of the most important presidential elections in American history. Dun, 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 dun. In 1860, the Republican Party chose as its candidate Abraham Lincoln, whose hair and upper forehead you can see here. He'd proved his eloquence, if not his electability, in a series of debates with Stephen Douglas when the two were running for the Senate in 1858. Lincoln lost that election, but the debates made him famous, and he could appeal to immigrant voters because he wasn't associated with the know-nothings. The Democrats, on the other hand, were, to use a historian term, a hot mess. The northern wing of the party favored Stephen Douglas, but he was unacceptable to voters in the Deep South, so Southern Democrats nominated John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, making the Democrats the last remaining truly national party, no longer truly a national party. A third party, the Constitutional Union Party, dedicated to preserving the Constitution, quote, as it is, i.e. including slavery, nominated John Bell of Tennessee. Abraham Lincoln received 0 votes in 9 American states, but he won 40% of the overall popular vote, including majorities in many of the most populous states, thereby winning the Electoral College. So anytime a guy becomes president who literally did not appear on your ballot, there is likely to be a problem. And indeed, Lincoln's election led to a number of southern states seceding from the Union. Lincoln himself hated slavery, but he repeatedly said that he would leave it alone in the states where it existed. But the demographics of Lincoln's election showed Southerners and Northerners alike that slave power, to whatever extent it had existed, was over. By the time he took office on March 1st, 1861, 7 states had seceded and formed the Confederate States of America, and the stage was set for the fighting to begin, which it did when Southern troops fired upon the Union garrison at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor on April 12, 1861. So that's when the Civil War started, but it became inevitable earlier, maybe in 1857, or maybe in 1850, or maybe in 1776, or maybe in 1619, when the first African slaves arrived in Virginia. Because here's the thing, in the Dred Scott decision, Chief Justice Taney said that black Americans had, quote, no rights which the white man was bound to respect. But this was demonstrably false. Black men had voted in elections and held property, including even slaves. They'd appeared in court on their own behalf. They had rights. They'd expressed those rights when given the opportunity. And the failure of the United States to understand that the rights of black Americans were as inalienable as those of white Americans is ultimately what made the Civil War inevitable. So next week, it's off to war we go. Thanks for watching. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller. Our script supervisor is Meredith Danko. The show is written by my high school history teacher, Raoul Meyer, and myself. Our associate producer is Danica Johnson, and our graphics team is Thought Cafe. Usually every week there's a Libertage with a caption, but there wasn't one this week because of stupid Chief Justice Roger Taney. However, please suggest captions in comments, where you can also ask questions about today's video that will be answered by our team of historians. Thanks for watching Crash Course US History, and as we say in my hometown of Nerdfighteria, don't forget to be awesome. Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course US History. Starting next week, we're going to be talking about the Civil War. And as you may have noticed, Crash Course doesn't usually focus on military history because we're more interested in causes and effects and that kind of stuff. But because we know that some in our audience are likely to insist that a series on American history has to include the battles of the Civil War, I am now going to tell you about every single fight of the war. Wait, Stan, this says there were 8,000 incidents of violence between the Union and the Confederate States of America between 1861 and 1865. Can that be right? All right, change of plans. I am going to tell you about every major battle of the Civil War.
The shooting started in 1861. In April, the first shots of the war were fired at the Battle of Fort Sumter, South Carolina, which the South won. Next was the Battle of Rich Mountain, which went to the North. First Bull Run happened in Manassas, Virginia in July. The South won. General Jackson got the nickname Stonewall, and the North realized that this war was going to be serious business. The South had another victory at Wilson's Creek in August, but lost to the Union at Carnifex Ferry in September. The North got another win at the Battle of Cheat Mountain, but the South finished the year strong with wins at Ball's Bluff and Chustinala. The North came roaring back in 1862 with wins at the battles of Mills Spring, Fort Henry, Roanoke Island, and Fort Donelson, where the Confederate general was named Simon Bolivar Buckner. What? There was also fighting in the West. The Union won at Pea Ridge, Arkansas, then won at New Madrid, Missouri. The Battle of Hampton Roads, Virginia in March was a draw and featured the first fight between two ironclad warships, the USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia. The Union won the Battle of Bern and the First Battle of Kernstown, and then there were draws at Glorieta Pass, New Mexico, and Yorktown. The Union won the Battle of Shiloh, where future Ben-Hur author Lew Wallace was accused of incompetence and cowardice. The Union also won the Battle of Fort Pulaski and the Battle of Forts Jackson and St. Philip, which gave the North control of New Orleans. The North then won the Siege of Corinth, and Union General McClellan fought one of the most indecisive battles he would be involved in at Williamsburg, Virginia, which is really saying something because he was pretty indecisive. Then Stonewall Jackson had a great run, winning battles at McDowell, Fort Royal, and Winchester. Union forces captured Memphis, Tennessee in May, but then lost a couple more battles to Jackson at Cross Keys and Port Republic. In Virginia that June, Robert E. Lee and George McClellan fought a series of 6 battles in 7 days, which were called the 7-day battles because historians are so good at naming things. There was a draw at Oak Grove, Union victory at Beaver Dam Creek, a win for Lee at Gaines Mill, ties at Garnett's and Golding's Farms, the Battle of Savage's Stations, and the Battle for Glendale. Then the Union finally won the 7 days at Malvern Hill, but McClellan withdrew after the battle, allowing Lee and the remaining Confederates to escape. And then in July 1862, one of the least consequential battles of the war took place in Stan's hometown of Newburgh, Indiana. A force of 35 Confederate irregulars built some fake cannons out of stovepipes that they called Quaker guns, crossed the Ohio River, captured some weapons and a hospital full of wounded Union soldiers, and then abandoned the town later that same day. Later that summer came the battles of Baton Rouge, Cedar Mountain, Manassas Station, the Second Battle of Bull Run, Chantilly, and Harper's Ferry, all of which the Confederates won. The Union then won at South Mountain, but lost at Munfordville. On September 17, 1862, McClellan ended Lee's invasion of the North at Antietam, Maryland. This was the bloodiest single day of the war, with 22,717 dead, wounded, or missing. The rest of 1862 saw the battles of Perryville, Fredericksburg, and Chickasaw Bayou. By the way, if this is starting to sound like baseball box scores, maybe you're getting a glimpse of why we don't usually do the military history. Right, but back to the Civil War. 1863 started in Tennessee with a Union victory at the Battle of Stones River, but also with a simultaneous Confederate victory at Galveston, Texas. There were lots of smallish skirmishes during the winter and early spring until the Battle of Chancellorsville in May, where Lee defeated Hooker, but Stonewall Jackson was mortally wounded. Jackson lost his left arm, and then Lee said, "I have lost my right arm." Jackson then famously proceeded to say, "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of those trees," and then died 8 days later. His arm, by the way, is buried with its own headstone near Chancellorsville. The North then won a bunch of battles in Mississippi at Raymond, Jackson, Champion Hill, and finally Vicksburg. That victory, along with the victory at Port Hudson, effectively ended the Confederates' ability to use the Mississippi River. Fighting in June 1863 in Virginia was inconclusive, with draws at Brandy Station, Aldie, and Upperville. And then July brought the Battle of Gettysburg, a major Union victory. This battle featured Pickett's famous charge. It was the end of Lee's second invasion of the North. It was the costliest battle of the war in terms of casualties, and it led to, surprisingly, the Gettysburg Address. The rest of that summer brought split results, 2 Confederate victories at Fort Wagner, South Carolina. They also won at Fort Sumter again, holding the fort against heavy Union bombardment, and they perpetrated a massacre of civilians in Lawrence, Kansas. The rest of 1863 saw battles at Bayou Forge, Arkansas, a major Confederate win at Chickamauga, the battles of Bristow Station, Wauhatchie, Rappahannock Station, Chattanooga again, Ringgold Gap, Fort Sanders, and Mossy Creek. Stan, are you making some of these place names up? A creek cannot be mossy. Oh my gosh, we're only at 1864. We gotta get moving. Stan, can you just indicate who won these on the screen? Awesome. The spring saw battles at Mansfield, Pleasant Hill, Louisiana, and Fort Pillow, Tennessee. Then there was the battles of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, New Market, North Anna, Old Church, and the Battle of the Cold Harbor, all in Virginia. Summer brought the battles of Marietta, Georgia, and Petersburg were all fought in Virginia as well. And there was Kennesaw Mountain, Georgia, Monocacy, Maryland, and Fort Stevens in the District of Columbia. By the way, Abraham Lincoln himself went to observe that battle, and the guy standing next to him got shot. Then there were the battles of Peachtree Creek, Georgia, Georgia, and Atlanta, Georgia, a major Union victory won by General Sherman. Also fought were the battles of Ezra Church, Georgia, the Battle of the Crater in Virginia, the battles of Mobile Bay, Alabama, Deep Bottom, Globe Tavern, and Jonesboro, Georgia, which solidified Union control of Atlanta. Okay, autumn 1864, we are really in the home stretch. The battles of Opequon, Fisher's Hill, Chapin's Farm, and Cedar Creek were all fought in Virginia, Johnsonville, Tennessee, the Sand Creek Massacre, the Battle of Franklin, Tennessee, Fort McAllister, Georgia, and Nashville, Tennessee finished out the year. All right, 1865, here we go. The battles of Fort Fisher, North Carolina, Hatcher's Run, Virginia, Bentonville, North Carolina, Fort Stedman, Virginia, Five Forks, Virginia, the Third Battle of Petersburg, Virginia, Fort Blakely, Alabama, Sailors Creek, Virginia, Appomattox Station, Virginia, and finally, the decisive battle at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia on April 8, 1865, which resulted in Lee's surrender to Grant. There were a few more minor skirmishes, but the war was over. So there you have it, an episode of Crash Course entirely about battles. What did we learn? Very little in the end. And I know I missed many battles of the war, but I also didn't miss many. There's no big finish today because I am exhausted from all of those battles and all of that fighting and death. Thanks for watching. See you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller. The script supervisor is Meredith Danko. Our associate producer is Danica Johnson. Today's show was written by Stan. And our graphics team is Thought Cafe. Every week there's a new caption for the Libertage. If you'd like to suggest one, you can do so in comments, where you can also ask questions about today's video that will be answered by our team of historians. Thank you for watching Crash Course, and as we say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome. Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we come at last to the Civil War, the conflict that in many ways created a nation. So here's what you won't be getting today. We will not be describing battles and tactics. If that's your bag, might I suggest Ken Burns, or if you prefer books, like 1,000 authors, my favorites being James McPherson and Shelby Foote. And number two, we won't be bashing and or praising Abraham Lincoln very much, although we do have multiple Lincolns here because we've heard that's good for ratings. I mean, to watch or read certain accounts, you would think that the Civil War was a lengthy chess game played by Abraham Lincoln against his cunning opponent, Abraham Lincoln. But of course, there were other people involved. We are going to quote a fair bit of Lincoln, though, because, you know, that won Tony Kushner an Academy Award nomination. 3, we won't be claiming that the Civil War was somehow secretly about something other than slavery, because that is just so early 20th century. And number 4, there will not be a lot of jokes today, because ha 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 ha, 700,000 people died.
Mr. Green, actually only 680,000 people died.
Yeah, it depends on how you count, you sniveling little ghoul, but recent estimates are between 680,000 and 800,000 total casualties, deadlier for Americans than the American Revolution, World War I, World War II, and Vietnam combined. So let's start with some basic facts about the American Civil War. 1861 to 1865, which corresponded with the presidency of Abraham Lincoln, the Union, or more colloquially, the North, fought against the forces of the Confederate States of America, or the South. Sometimes people call the Union the blue and the Confederates the gray, but in fact, the uniforms weren't very uniform. They were all different kinds of color, and also, with all that dirt and blood, they were all just brown. All right, let's go to the thought bubble. You'll notice from this map that not all the states that held slaves were part of the Confederacy. The border states of Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, and Maryland allowed slavery and never left the United States. All of these border states were critical to the Union. Maryland was north of the nation's capital in Washington, D.C. Kentucky controlled the Ohio River. Missouri was the gateway to the West. Delaware actually wasn't that important. So none of that should be particularly controversial unless you're from Delaware. But the causes of the war, that's another story. The Civil War was about slavery. Actual historians will back me up on this, like David Goldfield, who wrote, "Both Northerners and Southerners recognized slavery as the immediate cause of the Civil War." Also, Lincoln said in his second inaugural address, 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. That said, in comments, lots of people will be like, the war was about agriculture versus industry, or the states' rights to protect themselves from the tyranny of a big federal government. But if it were really about that, the Civil War would have started during the nullification crisis in the 1830s, when, as I'm sure you'll remember, Andrew Jackson said that South Carolina couldn't declare a federal tariff null in their state. Why didn't that cause a civil war? The Confederate government passed the first conscription act in American history, implemented national taxes, created a national currency, and had a government bureaucracy of about 70,000 people, more than the federal bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. Thanks, Thought Bubble. That said, in the beginning of the war, Lincoln deliberately tried to downplay the slavery angle, arguing that the war was only about preserving the Union. But the war was also about religion for both sides. As David Goldfield put it, in protecting the revolutionary ideals, Northerners would preserve God's plan to extend democracy and Christianity across an unbroken continent and around the world. Southerners welcomed a war to create a nation more perfect in its fealty to God than the one that they had left. But it's also important to remember that regular soldiers often had more prosaic reasons for going off to fight, as you will eventually learn when you are forced to read the Red Badge of Courage. Goldfield tells the story of one Alabamian who enlisted only after his girlfriend mailed him a dress and told him he should start wearing it if he wasn't willing to fight. And for Northerners, union, religion, and an end to slavery mixed together to form a potent rationale for war. It's summed up nicely by Julia Ward Howe's words to the song that would become famous as the Battle Hymn of the Republic. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free. You thought I was going to sing, but you were wrong. So spoiler alert, the Union won the war, which in a sense is unsurprising because they had massive advantages. For starters, they had many more people, approximately 22 million as compared to 9 million in the South, of whom 3.5 million were slaves and therefore unlikely to be sympathetic to the Southern cause. Also, the North manufactured more than 90% of all goods in America. Its factories turned out 17 times more textiles than the South, 30 times more shoes and boots, 13 times more iron, and 32 times more firearms. Plus, at the outbreak of the war, the North had 20,000 miles of railroad compared with the South's 10,000. This made it easier for the Union to move its army, which over the course of the war enlisted more than 2 million men compared with 900,000 for the Confederacy. Even Northern agriculture was more productive, taking greater advantage of mechanization than Southern farmers did. Really, the only advantage the South had was better military leaders, like most of the tactically famous generals of the Civil War, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, Jeb Stuart, etc., were Southerners, and also, by the way, they all had great last words. Lee said, "Strike the tent." Stonewall Jackson said, "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of those trees." And Jeb Stuart, after being mortally wounded in battle, said to his close friend and lieutenant, "Honey bun, how do I look in the face?" Famous Union General Ulysses S. Grant's last word was water, which isn't nearly so good, but he said that last word after having survived the war and getting to be like President of the United States and stuff. Right, but anyway, this all raises an interesting question. Was the result of the war a foregone conclusion? The Confederacy had to create a nation from scratch and build national unity among people who were committed to the autonomy of their individual home states, so that's a problem. And then there was the issue of overcoming class conflicts, especially when the ruling class was often exempted from actually fighting in the war. But when you put aside all that nation-building stuff and just focus on the actual fighting of the war, the question of the Union's inevitable win becomes much trickier. Some have argued that all the Confederacy really needed to do was outlast the Northern efforts to bring them back into the Union, like Washington had to do against the British. And the idea was that this war of attrition would eventually wear down Northern resolve. But there were two problems with this theory. First, the North had such superiority in its resources that it would take a long time to wear down. Secondly, fighting a war of attrition would be costly to the South as well, and their resources would be depleted long before the North's. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. Whoa! That was intense. I try to identify the author of the mystery document. If I am right, I do not get shocked, but I'm never right because Stan makes it too hard. All right, let's see what we got today. I therefore determined first to use the greatest number of troops practicable against the armed force of the enemy, preventing him from using the same force at different seasons, and second, to hammer continuously against the armed force of the enemy and his resources, until by mere attrition there should be nothing left to him but submission. Okay, so the strategy of attrition was a Confederate strategy, but Stan is a jerk. But it talks about the enemy and his resources, which was kind of a Union focus, and more importantly, it talks about preventing him from using the same force at different seasons. That makes me think it is a Union general. Final answer, Ulysses S. Grant. Oh!
How do you like them apples?
Grant was different from previous Union generals in that he was willing to sustain enormous casualties in pursuit of his goal to wear down the South. Because of this, Grant was often branded a butcher, like he was willing to weather incredible losses, including the 52,000 men, 41% of his army, who were injured or killed at the battles of the Wilderness and Cold Harbor. But his grim determination not just to defeat, but to destroy his opponent is what made Grant one of the first truly modern generals, and also the most successful leader the Union found. So Grant's brutal strategy, coupled with the vast superiority in Northern resources, suggests that the outcome of the Civil War really was inevitable, but it also points to some of the reasons to be cautious about that conclusion. First off, it took 3 years before the Union actually fully adopted Grant's strategy, and between 1861 and 1864, it was possible that Southern victories would eventually force the Union to give in. I mean, the Union lost a lot of battles in the first 2 years, largely due to ineffective generaling, and nothing saps a nation's motivation for war like losing. Now, some argue that the North had superior motivation to prosecute the war because they had God on their side and they were against slavery, but that's also pretty problematic. I mean, for many men who joined the Federal Army, a war to end slavery had very little appeal, especially poor enlistees who might be afraid that newly freed slaves would compete with them for jobs. Also, while we are correct in considering slavery unjust, Southerners who took up arms for the Confederacy saw themselves as engaged in a fight for their own freedom rather than a fight to protect slavery. The truth is, when it comes to fighting, motivation is a very tricky business, and I'm most comfortable agreeing with James McPherson, who argued that motivation waxes and wanes with victory, and that the outcome of the war was contingent on a number of turning points. And we're just going to discuss two of the most important, July 1863 and August 1864. July 1863 saw two of the most important Union victories in the whole war. In the Western Theater, General Grant laid siege to and captured Vicksburg, Mississippi, thus giving the Federals control of the lower Mississippi River. I mean, by then the North already had New Orleans, which made it pretty much impossible for the Confederates to ship cotton or anything else along the Mississippi River. After that, Grant was able to turn his attention to the east with the aforementioned hammering of the enemy and their resources. More famously, especially in the eastern part of the United States, the first 3 days of July 1863 saw the Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. This was General Lee's furthest major offensive in the North, and had he won the battle, it is likely that panic would have set in places like Philadelphia and maybe even New York. Actually, panic did overcome New York in draft riots that killed more than 100 people and only ended after troops from Gettysburg were called in. I'm not going to go into detail about either of these battles, but they shifted the tide of the war in favor of the North, although not enough to bring the war to a quick end. Confederate forces would never again threaten a northern city. August 1864 saw another turning point that really spelled the doom of the Confederacy, and that was when Union General Sherman took Atlanta. Atlanta was a railroad hub and manufacturing center, but its capture was more significant politically than militarily because it happened close to the election of 1864. And that American election was really the last time that the Confederate States of America could have won the Civil War. It's easy to forget this, but Lincoln actually had to run for re-election during the Civil War, and by the summer of 1864, the war was pretty unpopular and it looked like Lincoln might lose. The capture of Atlanta changed public opinion about Lincoln, and it meant that his Democratic opponent and former top general, George McClellan, didn't stand a chance of winning, which was really significant for the war because Lincoln was committed to ending it with a Union victory, and McClellan, I think it says a lot about American history that in the end, the war's outcome was ensured not just by military victories, but by a political one. Next week, we'll examine the effects of the Civil War and the enduring questions that have arisen out of it, such as who exactly freed the slaves. But until then, thanks for watching. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller. The script supervisor is Meredith Danko. Our show is written by my high school history teacher, Raoul Meyer, and myself. Our graphics team is Thought Cafe, and our associate producer is Danica Johnson, also responsible for Fell to Abraham Lincoln. If you want to suggest captions for the Libertage, you can do so in comments, where you can also ask questions about today's video that will be answered by our team of historians. Thanks for watching Crash Course, and as we say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome. Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we return to... Wait, what are we talking about today, Stan? Oh, the Civil War. I can tell because Lincoln's here. But this week we're not going to talk about casualty counts or battles or generals with their heroic and probably fictional dying declarations. Mr. Green, wait, did that one guy not really say, "Honey bun, how do I look in the face?" Because that was the best part of this whole class. Jeb Stuart did say that to me from the past, but it probably wasn't his last words. But anyway, today we're going to try to focus on what's really important. In the end, the really vital stuff isn't like Pickett's charge or Lee saying it as well well that war is so terrible, otherwise we would grow too fond of it, or the surrender at the Appomattox Courthouse. That stuff matters, and I don't want to deny it, but the Civil War and the way we remember it is still shaping the world today, and that's what I want to focus on, because it's the stuff that might actually change the way you think about your own life in your own country, whether it's the United States or the green parts of not America. So let's start with one of the big questions historians still ask about the Civil War. Did Lincoln free the slaves? The answer, as with so much here on Crash Course, is yes, and also no. Let's go straight to the thought bubble today. So Lincoln's reputation as the great emancipator rests largely on his Emancipation Proclamation, an executive order which went into effect on January 1st, 1863. This order ostensibly freed all the slaves in territory currently rebelling against the United States, i.e. in areas where the U.S. government had no authority to free slaves. This is rather like the United States announcing that from here on out, North Korea will be ruled by Lady Gaga. Sure, it's a great idea, but it's not really your jurisdiction. In areas where the U.S. did have the authority to free slaves, the border states and some of the areas of the Confederacy that had been effectively conquered and occupied by federal troops, those slaves were not freed. So Lincoln didn't free the slaves that he actually had the power to free. Many historians argue that, in fact, slaves freed themselves. How? By running away to Union lines and becoming, quote, contrabands. Because this was a time of war and slaves were seen as a valuable resource to the enemy, when they escaped and sought refuge with Union troops, Union commanders wouldn't give them back despite fugitive slave laws still being on the books. So many slaves escaped, the argument goes, that Lincoln was basically forced to issue the Emancipation Proclamation because until he did so, those contraband slaves were still technically property of their Southern masters, and the Union generals were breaking American laws by not returning them. The Emancipation Proclamation then had the added bonus of encouraging more slaves to come over to the Union lines, many of whom joined the Army, which eventually included about 180,000 former slaves and free black men. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So Lincoln may also have issued the proclamation in order to shift the focus of the war from Union to slavery to prevent the British from recognizing the Confederacy. Arguably, the Confederacy's best chance to win the Civil War was to get some kind of foreign patron, and Britain was the likeliest choice as it was very dependent on Confederate textiles. But as you'll remember from all those people going to Canada, Britain had already abolished slavery, and it was the historic source of abolitionist sentiment, and so it was very shrewd of Lincoln to make the war about slavery. Off topic, but if I may put on my world historian hat for a moment, thank you, Stan. The fact that the British did not recognize the South had profound effects on the whole world, because it meant that the British shifted their focus to Egypt and India as sources of cotton for their textile mills. All that noted, I think Lincoln does deserve some credit for freeing the slaves for two reasons. First, he pushed for the 13th Amendment, which actually ended slavery in the United States, and perhaps more importantly, he continued the war to its conclusion and demanded that the end of slavery and the return of the Southern states to the Union be conditions for peace. This may seem obvious today, but in 1864 it wasn't. In fact, there were numerous calls in the North for an end to the war that would allow the South to exist as a separate country and leave slavery intact. Now, of course, the rest of world history indicates that at some point slavery would have ended, but by prosecuting the war to its end, Lincoln brought about slavery's end sooner. But the Civil War didn't just end slavery. If it had gone differently, me from the past might have been annoying teachers in a different country from the one in which I now live. I might have needed a passport to visit my parents in North Carolina, and slavery might have survived for decades. Brazil didn't fully abolish slavery until 1888. And the South would be covered in green as part of not America, or the North, depending on where you're watching this video, I guess. And the people who lived through the Civil War knew it was momentous. In his famous Gettysburg Address, Abraham Lincoln fostered the idea that the Civil War was a kind of second American Revolution, or at least a culmination and reaffirmation of the first one. From these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. We tried to hire Daniel Day-Lewis for that, but he was unavailable. That phrase, new birth of freedom, had religious significance as well, because it was like the 19th century equivalent to born again. So the Civil War was the first modern war in terms of its scale and its destruction. Like others have waged war on civilians to break the spirit of their enemies. Stan, Mongoltage opportunity!
But new technologies made this one of the most destructive wars yet recorded. And yes, I know the Taiping Rebellion took more lives, and in terms of percentage of population killed, the contemporaneous war in Paraguay was worse, but bear with me. Rifles, and toward the end of the Civil War, machine guns, shifted the way that people fight. It became easier to defend a line, so cavalry charges and huge waves of attacks started to be just slaughtery, although it would take World War I for the rest of the world to figure that out. And the incredible numbers of dead and wounded really changed Americans' relationship with death itself. Like, the Gettysburg Address was given to dedicate a new national cemetery, and the Civil War helped to create a culture of meditation on mortality itself that led to cemeteries replacing churchyards as the final resting places for most Americans. And the sight of slaughter and the sheer weight of it had profound existential effects on a generation of American intellectuals, from Walt Whitman to Oliver Wendell Holmes. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. I guess the mystery document, and usually I am shocked. Oh my gosh, today's mystery document is on an iPad. This appears to be a photograph of wounded soldiers in hospital. I'm gonna go ahead and call it as being by Matthew Brady. What? I already got it? But I didn't say the name. Oh, it's called Wounded Soldiers in Hospital. Thank you for an easy one, Stan. So Matthew Brady was a prolific photographer during the Civil War, although like a lot of prolific people, he often took credit for work done by his employees. And Brady really changed the way that people thought about war. He and his staff created some 10,000 images during the Civil War, and it was the first time that an event had been photographically documented so thoroughly. By the way, lest you think that the unreliability of images began with Photoshop, many of Brady's photographs were staged. He would move bodies, sometimes soldiers were apparently told to act dead. But of course, at the time, photographs felt inherently authentic, and written accounts of battles could now be accompanied by actual images of the fighting and its aftermath. But perhaps the most important impact of the Civil War was the new nation that it created. Like, the American Civil War fits right in with the global phenomenon of nation building that was happening. Soon we would have places on the map like Italy and Germany, and older places like Greece would be reborn as nation states, and then all of these places would be known to Americans as not America. But by the way, congratulations to Italy on their recent election of their 732nd prime minister in just 180 years of existing. By far the most successful of these new nation states were the ones that embraced industrialization and modern ideas of organization and centralized government. Northern victory in the Civil War meant that the United States would follow the path that the North had laid down. It would become an industrial rather than agrarian nation with a national government preeminent over those of individual states. It would become a nation. And it's not a coincidence that over the course of the 19th century, people stopped pluralizing the United States. They stopped saying the United States are a great place to live and began saying the United States is a great place to live. The Civil War helped singularize what had been until then a plural nation. And Abraham Lincoln was the first president to truly expand the power of the executive. He ordered blockades and suspended habeas corpus, in addition to emancipating the slaves. But the Republican-dominated Congress played a role in this federalization too. Congress passed the Homestead Act in 1862 that encouraged settlement of the West by basically giving away land to anyone who had $18 and was willing to live on it and farm it for 5 years. Meanwhile, the Morrill Land Grant Act financed colleges to offer training in new scientific agricultural techniques. The Department of Agriculture was created to generate statistics and share best practices in farming. Congress also helped unify the country with massive land grants in the Pacific Railway Act of 1862. And during the war, the Lincoln administration gave away 158 million acres to railroads to tie the nation together. Get it? Tie. Railroad ties the nation together. I'll take my coat and go. Plus, as you may have noticed, wars are expensive, and in order to finance the Civil War, Congress passed the first progressive income tax in American history, as well as floating huge bond issues to the public. And when that wasn't enough, the administration began printing federal money on green paper called greenbacks. These, along with notes issued by banks under the National Bank Act of 1863, became the first national currency in the United States. Altogether, the total cost of the war for the Union was $6.7 billion. Interestingly, if in 1860 the federal government had purchased every slave and granted a 40-acre farm to each family, the total cost would have been $3.1 billion. But A, it would have been hard to get that bill through Congress, and B, at the time, the federal government had no way to raise that kind of money. The federal government also actively promoted the industrial economy that was to become dominant in the United States after the war. In fact, industrialization was so healthy that visitors to cities in the North during the Civil War would have been hard-pressed to notice that they were even in a war. So ultimately, the Civil War was a victory for Alexander Hamilton's Federalist vision of what America should be. I mean, Thomas Jefferson could never have imagined the United States that emerged from
from the Civil War, a government that supported an army of 1 million men, carried a $2.5 billion national debt, distributed public lands, printed a national currency, and collected an array of internal taxes. It sounds like Britain. So the Civil War wasn't just a victory of North over South or of freedom over slavery. It created the nation that the United States of America has become. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller. Our script supervisor is Meredith Danko. Too Far, our associate producer, is Danica Johnson. The show is written by my high school history teacher, Raoul Meyer, and myself, and our graphics team is Thought Cafe. Every week there's a new caption for the Libertage. You can suggest some in comments, where you can also ask questions about today's video that will be answered by our team of historians. Thank you for watching, and as we say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome. Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and huzzah! The Civil War is over! The slaves are free! Huzzah! That one hit me in the head? It's a very dangerous, Crash Course. So when you say don't aim at a person, that includes myself? The roller coaster only goes up from here, my friends. Huzzah!
Mr. Green, what about the epic failure of Reconstruction?
Oh, right. Stupid Reconstruction, always ruining everything. So after the Civil War ended, the United States had to reintegrate both a formerly slave population and a formerly rebellious population back into the country, which is a challenge that we might have met, except Abraham Lincoln was assassinated and we were left with Andrew I am the third worst president ever Johnson. I'm sorry, Abe, but you don't get to be in the show anymore. So Lincoln's whole post-war idea was to facilitate reunion and reconciliation, and Andrew Johnson's guiding Reconstruction principle was that the South never had a right to secede in the first place. Also, because he was himself a Southerner, he resented all the elites in the South who had snubbed him, and he was also a racist who didn't think that blacks should have any role in Reconstruction. Trifecta! So between 1865 and 1867, the so-called period of presidential Reconstruction, Johnson appointed provisional governors and ordered them to call state conventions to establish new, all-white governments. And in their 100% whiteness and oppression of former slaves, those new governments looked suspiciously like the old Confederate governments they had replaced. And what was changing for the former slaves? Well, in some ways, a lot. Like Fisk and Howard universities were established, as well as many primary and secondary schools, thanks in part to the Freedmen's Bureau, which only lasted until 1870, but had the power to divide up confiscated and abandoned Confederate land for former slaves. And this was very important because to most slaves, land ownership was the key to freedom, and many felt like they'd been promised land by the Union Army, like General Sherman's Field Order 15 promised to distribute land in 40-acre plots to former slaves. But that didn't happen, either through the Freedmen's Bureau or anywhere else. Instead, President Johnson ordered all land returned to its former owners, so the South remained largely agricultural, with the same people owning the same land, and in the end, we ended up with sharecropping. Let's go to the thought bubble. The system of sharecropping replaced slavery in many places throughout the South. Landowners would provide housing to the sharecroppers. No, thought bubble, not quite that nice. There you go. Also tools and seed, and then the sharecroppers received, get this, a share of their crop, usually between a third and a half, with the price for that harvest often set by the landowner. Freed blacks got to control their work, and plantation owners got a steady workforce that couldn't easily leave because they had little opportunity to save money and make the big capital investments in like land or tools. By the late 1860s, poor white farmers were sharecropping as well. In fact, by the Great Depression, most sharecroppers were white. And while sharecropping certainly wasn't slavery, it did result in a quasi-serfdom that tied workers to land they didn't own, more or less the opposite of Jefferson's ideal of the small, independent farmer. So the Republicans in Congress weren't happy that this reconstructed South looked so much like the pre-Civil War South, so they took the lead in Reconstruction after 1867. Radical Republicans felt the war had been fought for equal rights and wanted to see the powers of the national government expanded. Few were as radical as Thaddeus Tommy Lee Jones Stevens, who wanted to take away land from the Southern planters and give it to the former slaves, but rank-and-file Republicans were radical enough to pass the Civil Rights Bill, which defined persons born in the United States as citizens and established nationwide equality before the law regardless of race. Andrew Johnson immediately vetoed the law, claiming that trying to protect the rights of African Americans amounted to discrimination against white people, which so infuriated
Republicans that Congress did something it had never done before in all of American history. They overrode the presidential veto with a 2/3 majority, and the Civil Rights Act became law. So then Congress really had its dander up and decided to amend the Constitution with the 14th Amendment, which defines citizenship, guarantees equal protection, and extends the rights in the Bill of Rights to all the states, sort of. The amendment had almost no Democratic support, but it also didn't need any, because there were almost no Democrats in Congress on account of how Congress had refused to seat the representatives from the new all-white governments that Johnson supported. And that's how we got the 14th Amendment, arguably the most important in the whole Constitution. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Oh, straight to the mystery document today? All right. The rules here are simple. I guess the author of the mystery document and try not to get shocked. All right, let's see what we got today. Section 1. Be it ordained by the police jury of the parish of St. Landry that no Negro shall be allowed to pass within limits of said parish without special permit in writing from his employer. Section 4. Every Negro is required to be in the regular service of some white person or former owner who shall be held responsible for the conduct of said Negro. Section 6. No Negro shall be permitted to preach, exhort, or otherwise declaim to congregations of colored people without a special permission in writing from the president of the police jury. Gee, Stan, I wonder if the president of the police jury was white. I actually know this one. It is a black code, which was basically legal codes where they just replaced the word slave with the word Negro. And this code shows just how unwilling white governments were to ensure the rights of new free citizens. I would celebrate not getting shocked, but now I am depressed. So, okay, in 1867, again over Johnson's veto, Congress passed the Reconstruction Act, which divided the South into 5 military districts and required each state to create a new government, one that included participation of black men. Those new governments had to ratify the 14th Amendment if they wanted to get back into the Union. Radical Reconstruction had begun. So in 1868, Andrew Johnson was about as electable in the U.S. as Jefferson Davis, and sure enough, he didn't win. Instead, the 1868 election was won by Republican and former Union General Ulysses S. Grant. But Grant's margin of victory was small enough that Republicans were like, man, we would sure win more elections if black people could vote, which is something you hear Republicans say all the time these days. So congressional Republicans pushed through the 15th Amendment, which prohibited states from denying men the right to vote based on race, but not based on gender or literacy or whether your grandfather could vote. So states ended up with a lot of leeway when it came to denying the franchise to African Americans, which of course they did. So here we have the federal government dictating who can vote and who is and isn't a citizen of a state, and establishing equality under the law, even local laws. And this is a really big deal in American history because the national government became, rather than a threat to individual liberty, the custodian of freedom, as radical Republican Charles Sumner put it. So, but with this legal protection, former slaves began to exercise their rights. They participated in the political process by direct action, such as staging sit-ins to integrate streetcars, by voting in elections, and by holding office. Most African Americans were Republicans at the time, and because they could vote and were a large part of the population, the Republican Party came to dominate politics in the South, just like today, except totally different. Now, Southern mythology about the age of radical Reconstruction is exemplified by Gone with the Wind, which of course tells the story of Northern Republican dominance and corruption by Southern Republicans. Fortune-seeking Northern carpetbaggers seen here, as well as Southern turncoat scalawags, dominated politics, and all of the African American elected leaders were either corrupt or puppets or both. Yeah, well, like the rest of Gone with the Wind, that's a bit of an oversimplification. There were about 2,000 African Americans who held office during Reconstruction, and the vast majority of them were not corrupt. Consider, for example, the not corrupt and amazingly named Pinckney B.S. Pinchback, who from 1872 to 1873 served very briefly in Louisiana as America's first black governor, and went on to be a senator and a member of the House of Representatives. By the way, America's second African American governor, Douglas Wilder of Virginia, was elected in 1989. Having African American office holders was a huge step forward in terms of ensuring the rights of African Americans, because it meant that there would be black juries and less discrimination in state and local governments when it came to providing basic services. But in the end, Republican governments failed in the South. There were important achievements, especially a school system that, while segregated, did attempt to educate both black and white children. And even more importantly, they created a functioning government where both white and African American citizens could participate. According to one white South Carolina lawyer, we have gone through one of the most remarkable changes in our relations to each other that has been known perhaps in the history of the world. That's a little hyperbolic, but we are America after all. It's true that corruption was widespread, but it was in the North too. I mean, we're talking about governments. And that's not why Reconstruction really ended. It ended because, one, things like schools and road repair cost money, which meant taxes, which made Republican governments very unpopular because Americans hate taxes. And two, white Southerners could not accept African Americans exercising basic civil rights, holding office, or voting. And for many, the best way to return things to the way they were before Reconstruction was through violence. Especially after 1867, much of the violence directed toward African Americans in the South was politically motivated. The Ku Klux Klan was founded in 1866, and it quickly became a terrorist organization targeting Republicans, both black and white, beating and murdering men and women in order to intimidate them and keep them from voting. The worst act of violence was probably the massacre at Colfax, Louisiana, where hundreds of former slaves were murdered. And between intimidation and emerging discriminatory voting laws, fewer black men voted, which allowed white Democrats to take control of state governments in the South and returned white Democratic congressional delegations to Washington. These white Southern politicians called themselves redeemers because they claimed to have redeemed the South from Northern Republican corruption and black rule. Now, it's likely that the South would have fallen back into Democratic hands eventually, but the process was aided by Northern Republicans losing interest in Reconstruction. In 1873, the U.S. fell into yet another not quite great economic depression, and Northerners lost the stomach to fight for the rights of black people in the South, which, in addition to being hard, was expensive. So by 1876, the supporters of Reconstruction were in full retreat and the Democrats were resurgent, especially in the South. And this set up one of the most contentious elections in American history. The Democrats nominated New York Governor and NYU Law School graduate Samuel Tilden. The Republicans chose Ohio Governor and Kenyon College alumnus Rutherford B. Hayes. One man who'd gone to Crash Course writer Raoul Meyer's law school and another who'd gone to my college, Kenyon. Now, if this election had been based on facial hair, as elections should be, there would have been no controversy. But sadly, we have an electoral college here in the United States, and in 1876, there were disputed electoral votes in South Carolina, Louisiana, and of course Florida. Now, you might remember that in these situations there is a constitutional provision that says Congress should decide the winner, but Congress shockingly proved unable to accomplish something. So they appointed a 15-man electoral commission, a super committee if you will, and there were 8 Republicans on that committee and 7 Democrats, so you will never guess who won. Kenyon College's own Rutherford B. Hayes. Go lords and ladies! And yes, that is our mascot. Shut up. Anyway, in order to get the presidency and win the support of the super committee, Hayes's people agreed to cede control of the South to the Democrats and to stop meddling in Southern affairs, and also to build a transcontinental railroad through Texas. This is called the Bargain of 1877 because historians are so good at naming things, and it basically killed Reconstruction. Without any more federal troops in southern states and with control of southern legislatures firmly in the hands of white Democrats, the states were free to go back to restricting the freedom of black people, which they did. Legislatures passed Jim Crow laws that limited African Americans' access to public accommodations and legal protections. States passed laws that took away black people's right to vote, and social and economic mobility among African Americans in the South declined precipitously. However, for a brief moment, the United States was more democratic than it had ever been before, and an entire segment of the population that had no impact on politics before was now allowed to participate. And for the freedmen who lived through it, that was a monumental change, and it would echo down to the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s, sometimes called the Second Reconstruction. But we're going to end this episode on a downer, as we are wont to do here at Crash Course U.S. History, because I want to point out a lesser-known legacy of Reconstruction. The Reconstruction Amendments and laws that were passed granted former slaves political freedom and rights, especially the vote, and that was critical. But to give them what they really wanted and needed, plots of land that would make them economically independent, would have required confiscation, and that violation of property rights was too much for all but the most radical Republicans. And that question of what it really means to be free in a system of free market capitalism has proven very complicated indeed. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller. Our script supervisor is Meredith Danko. The associate producer is Danica Johnson. The show is written by my high school history teacher, Raoul Meyer, and myself, and our graphics team is Thought Cafe. Every week there's a new caption for the Libertage. You can suggest those in comments, where you can also ask questions about today's video that will be answered by our team of historians. Thank you for watching Crash Course. Don't forget to subscribe, and as we say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome.
This is Sal here, and I'm with Kim Cutts, who's Khan Academy's American History Content Fellow. And what I'm curious about is, you know, in school you learn about the Civil War, you learn about slavery, that slavery was a cause of the Civil War, but at least for myself, I never got a full context of, what were all the dynamics that led to the Civil War? Is it just something that happened overnight?
Oh, definitely not. I think the seeds of the Civil War were really with the United States at its creation. I think there's a sort of an essential contradiction in the United States as it's born. We're this country where all men are created equal, except that most of the states in the South have slavery, where people are clearly not created equal. So, they couldn't win the Revolutionary War without including those states and kind of giving them what they wanted and retaining slavery. But it means that, the U.S. is born with both free states and slave states, and they're going to continue to try to figure out how to balance those for the rest of the 1800s.
And we have this map here, and this map is a later period, but it shows this is actually closer to the Civil War. But if we even look at the original 13 colonies, you can see which ones were free states and which ones were slave states. And then you obviously have these other states that come in later, which we'll talk about. But what you're saying is, at the founding of the country, this was already an issue. People were, there were people in the North who weren't fans of slavery. And people knew that at some point this would be an irreconcilable, or maybe they hoped it would be reconcilable, a difference. But they said, no, we got to unify against Great Britain.
Exactly.
And so they said, let's just become a country and do it.
Even Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, he knew that slavery was a contradiction. He called the issue of having slavery like holding a wolf by the ears, right? You can't hold on to it, but you can't let it go, because so many of the wealthy elites who are going to end up in Congress in the South are slave owners. So
including himself.
Exactly. So they want to protect their interests.
So we have that it's the issue is there from the moment that the country is founded, and then we get into the 1800s, which is really the run up. The Civil War doesn't start until we get into 1860 or shortly thereafter. Or actually 1860. What's the big picture that really leads up to it?
Well, I think what we're looking at when we get into the issues that lead to the Civil War is really about how the U.S. handles getting new territory, right?
And the U.S. was getting a lot of new territory. We have a map here. I guess the first really big chunk is you have the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. And so you get all of, let me shade it in. You get, roughly all of this stuff right over here. So that's new areas that settlers can go and it becomes officially part of the U.S. And what else happens?
So, as we get these new territories, out of them, you're going to get new states. And when new states come into the Union, they're going to come in as either free states or slave states. So, we've balanced the interests of the North and South up until this point, right, from the Revolutionary War, so that there's equal representation in Congress between free states and slave states.
Well, why does someone care? If I'm someone in Massachusetts, why do I care whether the new state of Missouri is going to be a free state or a slave state?
Well, I think there are two reasons why you might care. First, if you're an abolitionist, and these are the people who we know very well, like Frederick Douglass or William Lloyd Garrison, who was the editor of the newspaper The Liberator. These are the people who feel that, correctly, slavery is morally wrong. Slavery is a corruption of the essential principles on which the country was founded. It's something that, destroys lives, destroys families. But another reason, if you're, say, in Massachusetts or Pennsylvania, why you might care whether a new state is a slave state, is you're worried about opportunities for yourself out in the West. We know that Horace Greeley, this famous newspaper editor, he says, what do you do if you're a young man in New York, a young white man who doesn't know how to get ahead? He says, go west, young man. You can go out there, you can get some land, you can start a farm. But if you go out there and you find that all of the land has been bought up by rich slaveholders from the South, you might not be able to get any land, and you certainly might not be able to, for example, sell your corn at a rate low enough that you could beat somebody who has free labor.
So there was a lot of times there's a lot of focus on the moral argument, which is a very strong argument.
Right.
But there's also this interesting economic argument, which you just talked about, which is it's hard to compete with slavery. I mean, you're literally talking about labor that does not need traditional wages.
Right.
That is literally slave labor. And so if you are having your own farm and you don't own slaves, how are you going to compete with that? And so that was the reason for some folks in the North on economic arguments. Now, would these people be considered abolitionists?
No, the way that we think about those, we call them anti-slavery. So anti-slavery advocates, they don't think that they can get rid of slavery in the South. Even if they don't like slavery in the South, they don't even see how it would be possible to get rid of it. But they do think that as these new states are coming into the Union, they could prevent them from becoming slave states so that it's possible for the Western lands to remain free. Abraham Lincoln, I think, is a really good poster child for this. I think we'll talk about him a little bit more later. But Lincoln is born in Kentucky, one of these new Western states. His father is a small white farmer. And slave owners move into Kentucky, later becomes a slave state, and his father can't find work. His father can't find land. So he ends up first having to move to Indiana, then moving to Illinois. And so this is literally a case of one of these poor white farmers who just can't compete with slavery, which is one reason why Lincoln himself is later going to come out so strongly in favor of making sure there's no slavery in the West.
So abolitionists want slavery is amoral. It needs to be removed from definitely the United States, possibly the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anti-slavery, they also think slavery is bad. They don't like it.
Right.
They think it's, but I'm not going to fight that fight to remove it. Maybe that's hard to do or impossible, right. But it shouldn't spread. It's not fair. It's the reason my dad wasn't able to be able to run his farm.
Absolutely.
And so when we get it, so that's you have the Louisiana Purchase, and in other videos we talk, that's famously Napoleon sold it for quite cheap because frankly he couldn't defend it because he was fighting these wars and he's fighting these wars in Europe. That's the first chunk of land. So you have all of these states, and they need to figure out whether they're slave states or free states. But I talked about why would a northerner care whether a slave or a free state? Why would a southerner care? Why would, if I'm a slave owner, I own a plantation in South Carolina or Georgia, why do I care if Missouri is a slave state or a free state?
Well, I think, just as their political interests are tied up in slavery, all of their money is tied up in slavery. In 1860, the most valuable thing that anyone owns in the United States is slaves, right? You can't compete with that kind of money. So they want to make sure that if a new state comes into the Union, that state isn't a free state, because then the free states might have more representation in Congress, and then they can vote to outlaw slavery. So if your whole fortune is built on slavery, if you're a white slave owner, they outlaw that, then you're left with nothing.
I see. So in the North, there's the moral argument, there's the economic argument, slavery is hard to compete with. And in the South, hey, if we have too many of these free states, at some point they're going to have a majority, enough of a voting power in the government to maybe abolish slavery one day, which would completely undermine, if I'm a slave owner, my economics of my reality.
Right. I mean, and they are sort of essentially amoral. Even, someone like Jefferson, who knows that slavery is wrong, his whole wealth, his whole fortune, his whole political dynasty is built on the fortune of owning slaves.
And one of the first points where this really gets balanced, this issue is, we have the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, then starting to carve out the Louisiana Purchase, you have states like Missouri, they get to their critical mass of people, of population, so that they can become a state. And so what was the Missouri Compromise all about in 1820?
So the Missouri Compromise is when we have enough people living in Missouri. These are white people generally who have come from the eastern states, and they apply for statehood. You've got an equal number of slave states and free states already in Congress. So if Missouri comes in and they want to be a slave state, they're going to upset the apple cart. They're going to upset the balance. So there will be more representatives for the South than there will be for North. And everything they've done so far has been predicated on this sort of tenuous balance between free states and slave states. So, they debate this in Congress just for months. And eventually what they do is say, all right, well, we can't decide. So what we're going to do is admit the state of Maine at the same time.
And Maine, the territory of Maine was already part of the United States. How is it not already a a state?
It was part of Massachusetts, but as you can see, it's really only tenuously connected to Massachusetts. So they divide this territory up so that it can have its own representation in Congress. So they say, all right, well, we can't solve this problem of the balance of power between free states and slave states right now. So what we're going to do is just kind of extend our balance. We're going to keep this compromise going to make sure that there are the same number of free and slave states. So we'll let Missouri in as a slave state at the same time we let Maine in as a free state.
Fascinating. So I think, I see where this is going, that you have these very tenuous compromises while more and more territory is being added. It's exciting to see where all of this goes. So Kim, in the last video, we started talking about how slavery has been an issue in the United States really since its founding with the Revolutionary War. And we see some images here of slavery. This was a particularly famous image that really kind of helped spark indignation in the North amongst abolitionists, because you can see how this person was beaten or whipped.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And so it's this kind of, and today it's like this morally reprehensible thing. But you go back not too far in the whole scope of history. We're going to the early 1800s, and this was something that was debated. It was slavery was allowed in a large chunk of the United States. And in the last video, we talked about that this issue of slavery only got exacerbated the more territory that was added. You have the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. That adds all of this territory. You start having states getting carved. Once you get a critical population, a critical mass of people in a certain state, they can apply to be, or in a certain territory, they can apply to be a state. And as each of these states are added and they want to get representation, it's a political issue. You mentioned how, the North, they didn't like it on moral grounds, and if it was a slave state, and they also didn't like it on economic grounds, because it's hard to compete economically with slavery, while the South was afraid of losing its political power if more free states were to join the Union. And, in Compromise of 1820, you mentioned that, that compromise, Missouri is a slave state, Maine gets carved out of Massachusetts, becomes a free state. But that didn't solve the problem. That problem only continues because we only add more territory.
Yeah, most of the history of the 1800s, when it comes to slavery, is a history of putting off the problem, right? Henry Clay becomes this very famous legislator because he's good at compromising. He's called the Great Compromiser. So instead of trying to actually solve the issue of slavery, which many people think of as an unsolvable problem, they're just saying, all right, well, how can we put off the conflict over this a little bit longer?
And they just keep doing that. In 1836, the territory expands further, or it starts to. I guess the expansion is catalyzed further by you have the Texas Revolution. Texas gets its independence from Mexico, which itself got independence only a few decades before that from Spain. But so Texas, for a brief amount of time, is its own independent country. But then it joins the U.S. It's annexed by the U.S. in 1845. So it's more territory for the U.S., and that was slave territory. Texas.
Right. Yeah. So again, this is an area in the South where most of the reasons that slavery existed in the South is because it's a very fertile agricultural region, right? Where the things that you grow, crops, are very labor intensive. So they figure, how are we going to find enough people to grow these crops? And the answer is that they've been importing African slaves and forcing them to work.
And the annexation of Texas, there's border disputes with Mexico, which leads to another conflict with Mexico, not this time with the U.S. and Mexico. This is the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848. But in the context of this conversation, the reason why it helped bring the slavery issue even more to a head is that when the U.S. wins it gets even more territory. It gets all of this area in the West right over here.
Right, it's more territory, and it's more sort of southern territory, which means that it has a high probability of becoming slave states.
And so this map that we looked at earlier in the other video, this is kind of showing what the U.S. looked like as we exit out of the Mexican-American War. We're getting to about 1850. And so what happens then? I mean, is it just one compromise after another at this point?
Well, this is the point where compromise begins to break down, right? Henry Clay, again, is the architect of what's called the Compromise of 1850. As soon as the U.S. goes to war with Mexico, people in Congress are wondering, all right, if we get this territory that we're trying to get, what's going to happen? Are they going to be free states or slave states? And this compromise over free and slave states has been going on, for 30 years since the Missouri Compromise, and, even longer if you take it back to 1776. So they're doing exactly the same thing. They're saying, all right, well, let's try to keep a balance of power between free states and slave states, except they add in a couple of provisos that make people really angry in the 1850s.
And who gets angry?
Both, I would say, slave owners and abolitionists and anti-slavery activists in the North.
So I guess that's what makes it a compromise. A little bit of something to make everyone angry. And so what made the slave owners angry about the Compromise of 1850?
Well, one of the parts of the Compromise of 1850, apart from deciding whether these new territories were going to be slave or free, was a part of the act was called the Fugitive Slave Act. And the Fugitive Slave Act said that it was a federal offense not to help slave owners recover.
So this was something that would make the abolitionists angry, or the
Yes.
anti-slavery angry.
Yeah, absolutely both. So, for example, if you're maybe living in Massachusetts, you're a white middle-class person living in Massachusetts, you don't think slavery is great. You think it's morally wrong, but it hasn't really directly affected your life, right? You're hundreds of miles away from the nearest slave state. But now the federal government says that if there is a person who has escaped from slavery, who has come to your town, it is a federal offense for you not to help return that person to slavery.
So this fugitive slave, this is part of the compromise. This is part of the Compromise of 1850. Is that I could be sitting in Massachusetts, I could be anti-slavery, or I could even be ambivalent about it, but now I have to be complicit in it. If there's a slave, I can't, or if there's someone who's escapes from the South who was a former slave, I have to actively, I can't in any way help them. If I do, I could go to jail. If I'm a law officer, I have to capture that person and I have to bring them back. So it's kind of forcing people who are already not happy about slavery. It's kind of bringing it close to them. They have to partake in it.
Yeah, and these are people who have very strong religious convictions. This is, the mid-19th century is a time when people feel their religion very strongly. And so there are people in the North who are Quakers, who are otherwise religiously opposed to slavery, who, have maybe prayed for the souls of slaves, but it's never been their job to try to keep someone in slavery before. So that is really infuriating. One of the things that you get out of this is a really strong backlash of abolitionist sentiment in the North. For example, Harriet Beecher Stowe, right, she's the daughter of a reverend who's against slavery. She writes the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, which becomes this smash hit.
And when
of
was
a book.
this roughly?
That was about 1852.
Okay, so this is after the Compromise of 1850. So people are getting it really is coming to a head. The people in the North, they're having to partake in this because of the Fugitive Slave Act. You have Harriet Beecher Stowe writes Uncle Tom's Cabin. It makes people even more upset about the realities of slavery.
Right. And in the South, they've kind of gotten away, white slave owners in this time, with people saying, slavery is not really my problem. I don't like it. But now they're seeing a concentrated attack, a moral and social attack against slavery in the North. And their response is to become even more violently in favor of slavery. They pose the idea that slavery is, not just something that we could turn our eyes away from, but it's necessary, but it's a positive good. Slavery is going to actually make the country better. If it weren't for slavery, all of these enslaved African Americans, their lives would be worse without us.
And so, just to be clear on the Compromise of 1850, and there was a bunch of things. We'll do a whole video on the Compromise of 1850, all of the different facets of it. But it's one of its, in terms of this conversation, one of its outcomes is because of the Fugitive Slave Law, it infuriated many of the anti-slavery abolitionists in the North. They became more entrenched in their positions, which made the Southerners more entrenched in their positions. The Southerners didn't necessarily. They liked the Fugitive Slave Law, the Southerners. The Compromise of 1850, it sounds like, it was a compromise. Not everyone was happy, but it sounds like it made the anti-slavery folks more unhappy than the slavery folks.
Yeah, absolutely. So it makes the anti-slavery folks super unhappy, but it also means that now white slave owners in the South, they feel like there's a target on their heads, and so they're going to dig in even further to make sure that their interests in slavery are protected.
And this gets us to the election of 1860, which I guess in some ways was the straw that breaks the camel's back, I guess, from a Southern perspective. And why is that?
Well, during the 1850s, you have all of these political battles over slavery. In fact, it kind of breaks the major political party of the 1850s, the Whig Party. So in 1860, some of these leftover Whigs, they reorganize as the Republican Party. And this is the first election with the Republican Party that we know today. But obviously in 1860, the things that they're interested in, their goals and aims are completely different. And the Republican Party is an anti-slavery party. They're deliberately and publicly against slavery. So they nominate as their political candidate for 1860 Abraham Lincoln, who is well known in the country for having been an anti-slavery agitator. He's given many speeches where he has made very eloquent arguments against slavery.
And we talked about it in the previous video, he's against it, I guess, on moral grounds, but perhaps even more, his own father wasn't able to be a successful farmer because he had to compete with slave owners.
Right. So he's brought up to hate slavery because it's a big business that has harmed his own family's economic future. But he comes, I think, to his own conclusion that slavery is morally wrong. What he doesn't think that he can do as president is legally or constitutionally get rid of slavery. He doesn't think that the Constitution allows it. But he is seen as enough of a threat by Southerners that in many cases on the presidential ballots in 1860, you couldn't even vote for Abraham Lincoln if you wanted to. He didn't show up on the ballot in Southern states. Nonetheless, he still gets enough electoral votes that he's elected.
And then that's what takes us into the real meat of, catalyzes the Civil War.
Yeah, stay tuned, Abraham Lincoln. Hey, Becca.
Hi, Kim.
All right, so we're here to talk about Uncle Tom's Cabin, and I think this is such an interesting book because when Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, he said to her, "So you're the little lady that started this great war." He said Uncle Tom's Cabin actually started the Civil War. So how does a book start a war?
I think that's a really good question, Kim, and these next two videos are going to help us understand a little bit more why Lincoln said that. How does a little book start a war? So this book was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Here she is, Stowe. And Harriet Beecher Stowe was born in Litchfield, Connecticut, to this kind of great abolitionist family. So what's abolitionism, Kim?
Well, abolitionism was the belief mostly in the early 19th century, that slavery should be ended immediately. So there were varieties of beliefs about the institution of slavery in early America. Some people obviously were very pro-slavery, believed that it was a natural institution sanctioned by the Bible. Some people, like Abraham Lincoln, at least early in his political career, just wanted slavery to stay where it was. And those were what we would call free soilers or anti-slavery advocates. They said, all right, we can't get rid of slavery in the South. It's too entrenched there as an institution, but we can make sure that it does not spread to any of the Western territories that we might settle in the future. But abolitionists were the strongest opponents of slavery. They said that slavery should be ended today, everywhere in the United States and the world, and that it is an immoral, unchristian institution. So these Western territories were a really big part of the increasing tension over the institution of slavery in the 1850s. So in 1848, the United States won the Mexican-American War, and they got a whole bunch of new territory that had once been Mexico. And these will become the states of Texas and Oklahoma and many of the sort of Midwestern states we have today. But this now threatened the balance of power between those slaveholding states in U.S. Congress and those that were free states. So now everyone is wondering, is slavery going to spread to the West? Should slavery spread to the West?
And this kind of anxiety about the Western expansion of slavery was more tense and became more sectionally divided after the Compromise of 1850. So the Compromise of 1850 happened right here in 1850. And the Compromise of 1850, I like to think of it kind of like a Band-Aid over this sectional tension. So I'll draw you guys a little Band-Aid.
This is like a gaping wound, right? And the Compromise of 1850 is just like this tiny little Band-Aid that's kind of holding this dam together, to mix my metaphors.
The Compromise of 1850 actually admitted California as a free state, which was a really big win for the North, obviously.
Right, lots of gold.
But it also had a really strong Fugitive Slave Act. So this was a really kind of critical part of the Compromise of 1850, and this was a big win for the South. So why was it a big win?
Well, the Fugitive Slave Act said that if a marshal was in your town requesting your help in rounding up an escaped slave, you had to help that marshal or face charges yourself. So this meant that any time that someone who was enslaved in the South made a run for the North, a run for Canada, as many of the enslaved people did, anyone in the North might be drafted to help return that person to the South.
And if they didn't, they were oftentimes fined, and this really made all Northerners participatory in slavery. Even if they weren't slaveholders themselves or living on a plantation in the South, Northerners were participating in the way that slavery was held together by disallowing runaway slaves from continuing their lives in free territories.
So you can imagine how this might really galvanize a Northern audience into action about slavery, because before you might think, well, I don't like slavery, but what does it have to do with me, right? I'm just a grain miller living in Pennsylvania. None of my business. I don't like it, but I can't do anything about it, and it's not my fault. Now, all of a sudden, if an escaped slave comes past your house and a marshal follows him or her, now you've got to be a person to round that person up. And so that means you have to participate in slavery directly. And so you might find yourself thinking, you know what, I refuse to do that. And that means that I really do hate slavery.
And this was definitely the sentiment that Stowe and her family had on the Underground Railroad. So Stowe lived on a stop in the Underground Railroad, and that was this passageway for Southern slaves to get to the North. And Stowe and her husband actually helped a lot of runaway slaves.
So the Underground Railroad wasn't like a literal railroad, right? I mean, that would be pretty sweet if there were a railroad that went under the ground all the way up to Canada. But it was more like a sort of informal network of people who might help escaped slaves, direct them to food and shelter, and just kind of send them along to the next waypost on their trip, either to the North or to Canada.
And so when the Fugitive Slave Act was passed with the Compromise of 1850, the Band-Aid, this really upset Harriet Beecher Stowe and really was one of the main catalysts for her writing this book. She also witnessed a slave auction, and this Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote about as just this terrible kind of scene of a family being just torn apart. And this was a really common practice within slavery, that the unit of the family was not respected as slaveholders wanted to sell their slaves to different plantations throughout the South. And this slave auction really became the basis for the plot of Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Slave auctions were absolutely terrible. In fact, not long before the Civil War, the main slave auction site in Washington, D.C. was just around the corner from the White House. So imagine walking down the thoroughfare of this great democracy, seeing the president's house, the seat of government, and then turning a corner and seeing people being sold off the block. You know, Abraham Lincoln saw a slave auction in New Orleans, and he said it was one of the things that most influenced him to hate slavery, just witnessing these families being torn apart. And imagine either watching a mother being sold away from her infant children, or being that mother, wondering what it would be like if you're ever going to see them again.
I think that's a really important point, just to show that this was something that was happening all around the United States, and this was just abolitionist fervor was bubbling up. And then in 1852, when this book was published, It really set into motion this new wave of political rhetoric and other novels, and just a lot of talk about these fundamental contradictions between Christianity and human bondage.
And we'll get to that in the next video. So Becca and I have been talking about Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is this book from the 1850s that Abraham Lincoln actually said started the Civil War. So how did this book start a war?
So in this video, we'll tell you a little bit more about the plot, but in the previous video, we kind of discussed what was going on in the country at the time, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, again, was from this abolitionist family. She was really deeply affected by the Compromise of 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Act, and also by slave auctions. So this video will get a little bit more into the heart of the plot of the novel, which does have to do with the family being torn apart.
All right, so what was Uncle Tom's Cabin actually about?
Uncle Tom's Cabin was set on a plantation in Kentucky, and it starts out with this kind of group of slaves that are about to be sold to other plantation owners. And so Eliza and her son actually run away. They run up north, so Eliza goes up north. And Uncle Tom is sold down the river.
So Eliza is trying to make sure that she and her son are not separated by being sold. So she decides that she's going to escape and take her son with her up to Canada. But Uncle Tom, he's not actually related to, he is sold in the opposite direction. He's getting farther away from freedom by heading down the Mississippi. When you think about the sort of geography of slavery, it's a much more urban environment in some of the more coastal areas. So you might be in Charleston, or you might even be in Baltimore as an enslaved person, and you might have a pretty high degree of freedom and also a possibility of escape, either by crossing the border or by boat. When you're sold into this sort of deep South area, you are deep in plantation country, and there might not be another soul that you could rely on to help you escape for 100, 200 miles.
And I think this is really something that Harriet Beecher Stowe wants to help point out in the book, that there was this sense of doom for Uncle Tom. However, his Christian faith was the only thing that really kept him going. And he bonded with this young white woman he met, Eva, just about their Christian faith. And really reading his Bible was the thing that got him up in the morning. So where were those kind of feelings about religion coming from?
You can definitely see that Harriet Beecher Stowe is influenced by her own family's faith, which is influenced by the Second Great Awakening. And the Second Great Awakening was this kind of flowering of religious belief in the 1830s and 1840s. It was kind of a reaction against the era of Enlightenment, which was what had inspired the founders of the United States to think of a more humanist world, a more rational, scientific world. People start going to camp meetings, they have religious revivals, they experience religious conversions. And in this time period, there's kind of a shift in thinking about God in the United States. If you think back to the Puritans, they have this incredibly punitive, sort of Old Testament destroyer God, right? One of the most famous early sermons in the United States is "Sinners in the hands of an angry God, that at any moment God might release you into the flames." Well, there's a new emphasis on Christ-like love in the early 1830s, 1840s. New interpretation of God as being forgiving and gentle, family-oriented. It's very Victorian. Where God was seen as this punisher who condemned most people to hell, in the Second Great Awakening, there's a new emphasis on a forgiving, kind, family-oriented Jesus who will save everyone. And that's very incompatible with the ideas of slavery.
Exactly. And I think that Uncle Tom's Cabin can really be considered a part of the Second Great Awakening because of the way that it points out these fundamental inconsistencies and contradictions between Christian faith and human bondage. How could a religion that says, treat thy neighbor as thyself, actually sanction slavery?
So Uncle Tom is kind of this martyr character, right? He is a devout believer in Christianity and the forgiveness of God right up until his very end. So how does Uncle Tom's Cabin actually end?
So Uncle Tom's Cabin ends with Uncle Tom is beaten by his overseers. He's sold kind of through this chain of different slave families in the Deep South, and he ends up with just a terrible, terrible slaveholder who requests his death, actually partially because he was reading all of this religious text.
And this slave owner was named Simon Legree. And kind of this name, Simon Legree, has actually stuck with us in popular culture to mean a really evil, cruel, punitive master.
And the rest of the family actually meets back up. Eliza is reunited with a bunch of other people that were on the original plantation. And they really think about Uncle Tom as this martyr. They hear of his death, and he's looked at as kind of this sacrifice for the cause of freedom.
Right. And then also Uncle Tom, he dies never having renounced his Christian faith. And his example of martyrdom actually leads everyone who witnesses his death, including Simon Legree, to convert to Christianity and to vow never to hold slaves again.
And I think the ending of the book really points out this main theme within a lot of Second Great Awakening texts, which was that if you just paid attention to how you were falling away from your Christian commitments, then you could get back on track and maybe bring people together by utilizing Christian faith in a productive and public way.
So the book is published in 1852. And then what happens? How do people receive this book?
We'll talk about this Tom mania that ensues in the next video. Hey, Kim.
Hey, Becca. So we've been talking about Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852 by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and said to have been one of the main causes of the American Civil War. So remind me again what Uncle Tom's Cabin was actually about.
So Uncle Tom's Cabin was about the horrors of slavery in the Deep South, and also appealed to a lot of Americans' Christian values and tried to point out these fundamental contradictions between Christian faith and slavery.
So it was published in 1852. How did people receive this book?
So there was a lot of mixed reactions, but it was the most read book of the 19th century. Wow. So there were a lot of reactions. And so in the North, mostly people were reading this all the time. No matter if you were an intellectual or just kind of a 17-year-old picking up a book off a shelf, you were going to read Uncle Tom's Cabin. And a lot of the people that actually read the book were young men that would later fight in the Civil War.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so like this would be our book club book of the month, except this was like the Oprah's book club choice of 1852. Right?
Exactly.
Everybody was reading it.
Yeah, there's really almost nothing like it, like not even Harry Potter, but it did have the same international scope that Harry Potter does today.
So it was popular in the northern United States and elsewhere in the world. So where else was it popular?
Mostly in Europe, but it was translated into over 60 languages.
Wow.
And this also kind of put the spotlight on American slavery. So there was all this international attention. What is going on in America, and what's going to happen?
It's so interesting. It reminds me of The King and I. If you've seen that, the woman goes to Siam and shows people the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, and they put on a version of a play based on Uncle Tom's Cabin in what would be Thailand.
So this makes it this kind of international spectacle. The fate of slavery had to be somehow figured out, and everyone was watching.
That's so interesting. So I'm imagining that white Southerners were not big fans of this book.
So white Southerners were definitely not a fan of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And in response, there was this movement of these things called anti-Tom novels. So here's an anti-Tom novel right next to us, right over here, Aunt Phyllis's Cabin. So Aunt Phyllis's Cabin, yes, very creative name. These anti-Tom novels aim to point out that maybe Harriet Beecher Stowe didn't know what she was actually talking about. They also accused Harriet Beecher Stowe of not actually even living in the Deep South, so she didn't even know what slavery was like. They wanted to paint Southern slave society in this really positive light. They wanted to show all the ways that it actually maintained social order and promoted economic welfare. So this was kind of this response from the South, also in novel form.
Yeah, so it's this big kind of cultural battle over the interpretation of slavery. You have people on one hand saying, slavery is destructive to families, slavery is incompatible with Christianity, and then responses from the white South saying, oh no, actually slavery is great, it helps everybody.
Right, so there was this kind of battle within the literary community about the peculiar institution of slavery. Which one was it?
So what if I'm illiterate, right? I mean, not everybody in 19th century America was a New England intellectual who was reading Christian novels. How would I have heard about Uncle Tom's Cabin?
That's a really good point, Kim. So, Tom shows were depictions of Uncle Tom's Cabin in theaters around the world. And so they were oftentimes put on by abolitionist people trying to point out the issues with slavery today and end slavery immediately.
So this is before there's copyright law, right? So you can just put on a show of anybody's novel if you feel like it.
Exactly. But oftentimes they really misconstrued the novel and actually now are remembered as contributing to the problem of racism in America.
Racial stereotypes, too, I would imagine, because we still have this phrase, Uncle Tom, kind of to mean an African-American who is a martyr to the status quo as opposed to someone who might fight against racism. It seems like they might have borrowed a lot of these stereotypes from minstrel shows, which were also very popular in this time period.
And some of the characters within these minstrel shows turned into the character that was remembered as Jim Crow, which became the dominating racial order after the Civil War. So in the civil rights era in the mid-1950s, lots of activists actually wanted to completely reject the progress that Uncle Tom's Cabin and these Tom shows had made because they actually reduced African Americans to this terrible stereotype. And so later on, this kind of idea that someone was an Uncle Tom became a racial slur, really. And they then rejected Uncle Tom's Cabin as being a tool towards racial equality and more saw it as a part of the problem.
So I think the most important thing about Uncle Tom's Cabin is that it's this catalyst of really intense emotions about slavery, which in the 1850s will lead eventually to the Civil War. And, following the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, you'll see more and more violence on both sides of this issue. For example, John Brown, this famous abolitionist, actually goes out to Kansas and murders people.
And I think that Lincoln was very astute in pointing out that Uncle Tom's Cabin really catalyzed a lot of this violence. And he even met with Harriet Beecher Stowe. So she earned herself a little meeting with Abraham Lincoln.
And he said, "So you're the little lady that started this great war." I'm trying to think of another book that has started a war.
I think we would probably remember that. But I do think Lincoln was really astute in pointing out just how impactful this cultural phenomenon, this Tom mania, was on the question of slavery and on the fate of the American people. And really, it just begged the question in a new way in this kind of public setting. I mean, I just think that the book itself, the way that the book could just travel all around the United States and so many different kinds of people were able to read it and get their hands on it, this really was just this movement of people just thinking a lot about slavery, reading a lot about slavery.
Yeah, well, I think, after Uncle Tom's Cabin, I don't think there was a way to not have an opinion on the slavery issue. Either you were for it or you were against it, and that divisiveness would lead to the Civil War.
And again, there's this international focus, there's a deeper sectional divide between the North and the South, and there was this kind of sorting over the slavery question that Uncle Tom's Cabin really promoted.
So, Kim, we've been talking about the run-up to the Civil War. We talked about the Compromise of 1850, which angered a lot of anti-slave and abolitionist folks in the North. As we get to the election of 1860, you have Abraham Lincoln getting elected. And a lot of folks view that as a bit of the final catalyst for the Civil War. What's happening, and is that accurate?
So Lincoln is elected as a Republican Party president. This is the first Republican Party president ever. And the real basis of the Republican Party is an anti-slavery platform. They really don't want slavery to extend into the Western territories that have been acquired through the Mexican War. And so they have been making both sort of an economic and, to some extent, moral argument against slavery. So when Lincoln becomes president, the states of the South, particularly the Deep South or this Cotton Belt area, whose entire economic system relies on slavery, they think that they are under attack, that Lincoln is going to be coming for slavery as soon as he gets a chance as president.
And we're talking about these states down here. This is Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida.
Right. So these are the real cotton states where slavery is highly entrenched. More than 50% of the population is enslaved, working on cotton plantations. It is making the elite people, elite whites in the South, very wealthy. Cotton is just the backbone of their economy.
And so what do they do? Lincoln gets elected. This is November of 1860.
That's right.
And so what do they do about it? They're afraid.
They're afraid that Lincoln is going to do something about slavery. So over the course of this winter period, this is in a period before we moved the inauguration up to January. So it used to be that presidents would be elected in November and not take office until March.
Yeah, we have here this Lincoln gets elected in November, but then he doesn't get inaugurated until March over here.
So there's this long lame duck period where everyone knows that a new political party is going to be in power, a new president is in power, but he's not in office yet.
And so you have James Buchanan sitting around. He's still the president, but
yeah, his days are numbered and his power is pretty limited. So over the course of what they call this secession winter, the 7 states of the Deep South get together and they secede from the Union, one after another. And this includes South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. They secede from the Union and they form what they call the Confederate States of America, which is basically almost exactly the same as the United States of America. Their constitution is based very closely on the U.S. Constitution, but it guarantees the existence of slavery. It explicitly says that slavery is allowed and protected forever, and they elect Jefferson Davis as their president.
And so when they seceded, it was for them, it was clearly about slavery.
Right. Everything is about slavery. They are concerned that Lincoln is going to interfere with slavery. They are afraid that because slavery is being outlawed many other places in the world, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, that one way or another, slavery's days are numbered, and if they're going to protect their livelihood as slave owners and as cotton planters, they're going to have to form their own nation to make sure that it's protected.
And James Buchanan is officially president when all of this has happened. You have 7 states of the United States, I guess they're not so united anymore, leaving. I mean, is he just powerless to do anything?
Well, he tries a few things. He was a very ineffective president to begin with. It's hard to be an effective president when Congress is so divided over issues. One thing that Congress actually does before Lincoln is in office and before these states officially secede is they try what's called the Crittenden Plan, proposed by John Crittenden of Kentucky, saying, we will officially protect slavery in the Constitution. We will say that you can't outlaw slavery in the South, and we'll even extend this Missouri Compromise line, which was sort of the official line between North and South, between free states and slave states, all the way to the Pacific. So just so you know, Southern states, we'll make sure that we won't get rid of slavery.
So this Crittenden Compromise, this was kind of a last-ditch effort. Everyone started to see the writing on the wall that these 7 states especially were very loose in the socket.
Right.
And this was a last-ditch effort to keep them in the Union, perhaps.
Yeah, and it's really, I don't want to say it's too little too late, but for the South, they have seen the writing on the wall. They've seen that this is going to be their only opportunity to secede. And
Lincoln got elected and his whole party is based on being anti-slavery.
Right. So they want to get out while the getting is good so that they can make sure that slavery remains in their states.
All right. So during the lame duck period, the 7 states, these deep South states, they secede. Then Lincoln gets inaugurated. He is now president. And we're not really in the Civil War yet.
No, in fact, Lincoln's inaugural address is very conciliatory. We think of Lincoln as being a really great orator, and he certainly was, but his first inaugural address, if you read it, is very much a a plea to the South saying, hey, I'm not planning on outlawing slavery, right? So the anti-slavery platform that Lincoln ascribes to is specifically about not extending slavery to the West. So he's saying, I am not in favor of getting rid of slavery where it is, so there's no reason for you all to secede. Come back, everything will be situation normal.
And they don't.
No. As I said, they've already seen that this is their opportunity to make sure that slavery continues by creating their own nation. So in the South, there are a bunch of arsenals and forts that belong to the United States, and most of these are taken over by the Confederacy when it becomes its own nation.
And this is a picture of one right here. This is Fort Sumter.
Right, so Fort Sumter is
right there,
right in Charleston Harbor, and this is a Union fort or a United States fort that's holding out, basically. They're running out of supplies. They have tried to have supplies brought in to them before, which have been repelled. And
so holding out, they're well in Confederate territory,
right?
But they are still controlled by, I guess you could say, United States soldiers.
Right. So they do not want to surrender this fort. And Lincoln lets the Confederates, the rebels, know that he wants to resupply this fort. And the Confederates instead fire on Fort Sumter. They start lobbing artillery at it. And over the course of a day, they force the Union forces in Fort Sumter to surrender. And
this was the real matchstick for the war, but this wasn't the first tension.
No, obviously, this had been going on for some time.
So even into Buchanan's, in his lame duck period, there's probably a little bit of tension.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to be expansive, you could say that this tension is almost built into the Constitution when they don't.
Oh, yeah, you go really far back.
Right.
But especially even post-secession of these first 7 states, there are already some tensions, especially if they're taking over these forts. Former United States soldiers are now thinking about cutting off supplies to other former United States, or to current United States soldiers. And then Fort Sumter sounds like this was definitely the straw that breaks the camel's back.
Yeah, this is the tinderbox, and I think it's maybe intended to be a tinderbox on both sides, because Lincoln wants to be sure that if there's going to be a war, the North isn't going to fire the first shot. They want to make sure that this is the South's decision. It can be blamed on them if it needs to be. And
this is a pattern you see throughout history, is that no one, at least, wants to officially be the person to fire the first shot.
Right.
They often look for a good reason to fire the first shot because they want to get into war, but everyone wants to have the moral high ground.
Right. And in the South, they are looking to make sure that this is kind of a morale building moment. When they fire on Fort Sumter, they're firing on federal fort, right? In any circumstances, that's going to bring on war. And they're hoping that if they can kind of get this fire started, then these 4 other slaveholding states, or actually 8 other slaveholding states in the South, are going to join the effort. And that's pretty much exactly what happens. So after they fire on Fort Sumter, the fort is surrendered to the Confederacy. Lincoln says, okay, you want to start a war? We got a war. He calls for 75,000 troops, volunteers to put down the insurrection. And he calls them for a 90-day service period, which tells you how long they thought this was going to last. And after Lincoln has asked for this army, 4 more slaveholding states in the South secede. And that's Virginia, the most important of these. Is going to be the real battleground of the Civil War.
And that was today we consider that West Virginia and Virginia, but that was Virginia back then.
Right. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina also joined the Confederate States of America. And the war is on.
Fascinating. All right, Kim. So we left off in, I guess, early mid-1861. You have Lincoln gets inaugurated, Fort Sumter, which is kind of the first real conflict of the war, if not the first major battle. Lincoln forms this volunteer army, and then And then the rest of the southern states secede. 4 more states secede.
Right.
And then what was the first major conflict?
So the first major conflict comes after a number of months. There are a couple of little skirmishes here and there, but nothing super large until about 60,000 troops meet outside of Manassas, Virginia, at a place called Bull Run. An interesting fact, I think, is that Union armies and Confederate armies actually named battles different things, if you've ever been confused about this. The Union armies tended to name battles after bodies of water, whereas the Confederate armies tended to name them by nearby towns. So if you've ever heard the Battle of Manassas and the Battle of Bull Run, they're actually the same thing. It's just the Union officers are talking about this creek, Bull Run, whereas the Confederates are talking about the town nearby.
I see. And there's 60,000 troops between the two of them.
Right. So they meet, and this is very close to Washington, D.C., so much so that people go out and they bring picnics to watch this battle like it
They think it's going to be entertaining.
Yeah, they think it's going to be like a football game, and it is not like a football game. It is a gigantic battle. 800 people die that day, which doesn't sound like a lot to us, but it was the most deadly battle ever in American history up until that point. So it's a Confederate victory, which is very surprising to the Union because they think that they have such superior forces that this is really going to be a very short war. You know, this is a quick rebellion in 90 days. We're going to be able to, suppress this rebellion, and that'll be it. But Bull Run is really the first sign that this is going to be a major war. It's not going to be quick, and it is going to be very deadly.
This was July of
1861.
1861. Okay, so
Right.
now it's clear to both sides, especially I guess you could say the North, that this is not going to be a short war. So they need to prepare. Like, how are they approaching this?
Well, so both sides have some advantages and disadvantages. For the South, they have some of the same advantages that the United States would have had during the War for Independence. They have home court advantage, we could say, which is that they know the territory very well. And also there's a real incentive for people to protect their homes, right? You're going to care more about a war that's happening on your property than a war that's going to happen very far away. The other advantage that they have is just really, really terrific military leadership. So they have Robert E. Lee, who is widely considered the greatest general of his era. He's truly a military genius. He, in fact, was offered a commission in the Union Army, but when Virginia seceded, he went with Virginia. He preferred his home state. So he is a terrific general, and the Union is going to really struggle to come up with the kind of military leadership that the South has.
Who's in charge of the Union or the Northern, or I guess you say the United States Army?
The United States Army. The first general that Lincoln puts in charge is George B. McClellan. And this is problematic for a lot of reasons. One is that George McClellan is a Democrat, so he doesn't agree politically with Lincoln. I think he would have preferred peace. In fact, in 1864, he runs against Lincoln for president on a platform of letting the South go, basically. And so Lincoln is struggling to match the South when it comes to military leadership, but he does have other advantages. For one thing, there are 4 times as many free people in the North as there are in the South.
And that's an interesting, I mean, you made the point, free people.
Right.
Because the South, as you mentioned, it has a majority of the population was not free.
I wouldn't say a majority of the population. In many states, that was the case.
In the Deep South states.
In the Deep South
was more
states.
likely to happen. Okay.
Right. But so there are only about 9 million people living in the South. And of those 9 million people, 3.5 to 4 million of them are enslaved. So they're not going to be fighting to continue the institution of slavery. By contrast, the North has 22 million people, and it also has a terrific industrial base, right? One of the major cultural differences between the North and South that leads to the Civil War is that the South is primarily agrarian and the North becomes very industrial. But industry is really helpful in a war. They've got, miles and miles of railroad tracks, which means that they can move supplies very quickly. And they also have, hundreds and hundreds of factories that make it easy for them to make munitions.
And this is the middle of the Industrial Revolution, so
right.
And the industrial base matters a lot. And so, what's given the North's advantages and the South's advantages? How do they vote? What's their strategies? How do they try to play to their strengths?
Right. So the South, they are basically trying to outlast the North. They know that they have this territory. And if the North wants them to come back into the Union, they're going to have to conquer this territory. And, even though it's hard to kind of tell, the territory of the South is actually larger than Western Europe. So in a way, the North has a bigger job to conquer the South than the Allies did in World War II to conquer Europe. So they know that the South is going to or the North is going to have to fight a war to conquer them, whereas the South just needs to win the war of waiting,
of attrition, of just seeing.
Yeah, they're hoping that the North will get tired of fighting.
Fighting in another person's land, you're not defending your own land.
Right, and they know that there are plenty of whites in the North who don't care about slavery. It's not in their...
They're indifferent. What do they care?
What do they care? In fact, some people are afraid that if the slaves are freed in the South, they're all going to come up north and they're going to compete for labor with poor white people. So there are plenty of whites in the North who have no interest in the slaves in the South being freed, even if that's, not an early war aim of the North. So the South is hoping that maybe they can win a couple of really big battles that show that this isn't going to be a big war.
Or it would be so painful for the North to try to conquer the South, so to speak.
Right. And they're also trying to show that they're serious to an international audience, particularly England, because the South is producing 3/4 of the world's supply of cotton at this point. And England is an industrial nation which is built in many cases around textile manufacturing. So they're hoping that if they show that they are serious about their own nationhood, that they're going to win this war against the North, that England will intercede on their behalf to protect their supply of cotton.
So this would be an appeal to England on purely economic grounds.
Right.
Fascinating. Because England, they didn't have slavery.
No.
They weren't, but purely economically.
Right.
At least appeal to them.
So, on the other hand, the North's strategy is what they call the Anaconda Plan. And the idea of the Anaconda Plan is that they are going to squeeze the South economically. What they want to do
like an anaconda.
Like an anaconda, right. So they want to blockade the Atlantic Ocean because they don't want the South to be able to sell their cotton to get money. And they also don't want the South to be able to buy the kinds of things that they're going to need to make a war happen. Yeah. They also want to control the Mississippi River because that's the real main artery of commerce in the West, right? Anyone who is going to be shipping their grain or their cotton is going to be shipping it down the Mississippi to the port of New Orleans. So the Union hopes that if they can basically surround the South and make sure nothing gets in or out, then eventually they're just going to starve to death.
And this also goes to the industrial base. It can also produce more ships and et cetera.
Right. And it takes them a while to do that. In fact, at the start of the war, the Union only has 90 ships. I've heard it compared to 5 leaky boats, right? We're not a naval power at this point. And so it's going to take them a while to build up the kind of naval power they need to do that, because this is a 3,500 miles of coastline that they're going to need to patrol.
And it looks interesting. I'm just looking at this map, not getting too much into the details. It looks like a lot of the battles are concentrated right in this Virginia, Maryland area. And then there's more, it's a little bit more sparse, but you have a few that are in the deep south and along this Mississippi corridor.
Right. So there are 2 major theaters of the war. We'd say the Eastern Theater, and this is that sort of 100-mile corridor between Washington and Richmond, where a huge amount of the fighting takes place. You know, it's important to remember that the capital of the Confederacy and the capital of the United States are only 100 miles apart.
Its capital is in, you can't see it in this map, but
right.
it's someplace in the middle of Virginia, and then D.C. So it's literally, as you mentioned, you said it was 100 miles apart?
Yep.
Fascinating. All right, Kim. So where we left off, Lincoln gets elected in November of 1860. He's not inaugurated until we get into 1861. Shortly after his inauguration, you have the whole situation at Fort Sumter, which is really the start of the Civil War. We don't have the first major battle until we get to Bull Run. And the overall, I guess you could say, theaters of war, we have this corridor here in the Northeast in Virginia and Maryland, and you also have it in the West along the Mississippi. And the North, the strategy is, well, let's use our industrial base, let's use our larger population, let's use our Navy to see if we can stop, if we can essentially blockade the South, while the South says, hey, we have the home court, we have better leadership, we just need to outlast the North. And so what happens as we get started? We talked about Bull Run being the first major battle. Who kind of comes out better in some of these first engagements?
Well, I think it's a surprise to everyone when the South does much better in the first year of the war than the North, knowing the major advantages that the North has in industrial power, in railroads, and just in the sheer number of people. It's very surprising that the leadership in the South does such an incredible job of really blocking the North's advances. The North is attempting to take Richmond, and Lee repeatedly keeps General McClellan from getting to Richmond.
And then Lee actually goes on the offensive to some degree. I mean, the South essentially wins Bull Run, and they have a series of victories, as you mentioned, in year one.
Right. So one problem that the North has is that Lincoln's generals are just not nearly as skilled. George B. McClellan, that we've talked about, his idea of the South's power is perhaps considerably greater than the South's actual power is. He is forever telling Lincoln, I need more troops, I need more supplies, send me more things. He loves parading his army, but I think he was actually a little too close to the troops himself. He was really afraid to lose anyone, which made him very popular with the army, but drove Lincoln crazy because the North comes out with this really strong numeric and industrial advantage. And as McClellan delays, it gives the South time to build things up over and over again. In fact, Lincoln, who we often think of as being sort of this great grandfatherly sweet character who has so many words of wisdom, his letters to McClellan are downright snarky. He says to McClellan, if you're not using the army, could I borrow it?
So, and is that what historians believe too? I mean, it looks like Lincoln felt that the reason why year one went in favor of the South, and you know, when we talked about in previous videos, everyone thought this was going to be a fast engagement. The North had all of these advantages. Lincoln believed that maybe it was McClellan wasn't being aggressive enough.
Yes, absolutely.
And do historians believe that too?
Yeah, no, I think that's true. It's really borne out by the numbers that in many cases where McClellan thought he was facing just thousands of troops, he was really only facing a fraction of that.
And so that made him be a little bit more
He was
cautious.
very cautious.
And so at what point is a turning point, at least in these early stages of the Civil War, as we have here on this timeline, we go from April 1861 to roughly April 1865. The first year, so I could draw that. So the first year would be roughly this. So then we've had several battles after Bull Run, but then we get to Antietam.
Right. So Lee, since he's done so well in Virginia, he decides that he's going to take the army to the north. This is the first time that he heads up into the border state of Maryland, and he meets at Antietam Creek with McClellan.
And this goes back to the naming conventions between the North and South. It's called Antietam. That's the body of water, which the North does. This is Antietam right there.
Right. While the South refers to it as the nearby town, which is Sharpsburg, Maryland.
I see. And once again, this is a big deal. This is the South invading the North now, taking to the offensive.
Right. And this is the bloodiest day in American history when...
Let me make sure I digested what you just said. The bloodiest day. So even, I imagine things like Pearl Harbor and D-Day.
Right. So 4,000 Americans died on a single day, September 17th, 1862, when these two armies meet at Antietam. And on no other day in American history have so many Americans died. Not even on September 11th did that many Americans die.
And was this a surprise to folks?
Yeah, well, I think one of the truisms, perhaps, about military strategy in general is that people are always planning for the last war. Mm-hmm. They're not planning for the next war. And so they learn from their mistakes, but what they don't know how to do always is anticipate what's going to be new about this war. And there were so many new inventions during this time period that really made the Civil War an incredibly deadly war.
Yeah, and you can see, these are pictures. These are Antietam right here.
This is Antietam, yes.
And this is actually looks like Lincoln and McClellan.
Right, meeting at Antietam.
Which is incredibly bloody. And you talk about new technologies or new weapons. This rifle here looks like one of them.
Yes. So this is a war where there's a transition from the musket to the rifle. And what's different about a rifle is that inside the barrel of a rifle, there is a sort of spiral-shaped groove. And this spiral-shaped groove makes the rifle much more accurate at a much farther distance. It's sort of the difference between just hurling a football end over end and throwing a spiral. So you can hit a target at 600 yards, which is much
unheard
much greater.
Of for a musket, or hard, very hard with a musket. So it gets the bullet spinning, which keeps it on its trajectory better.
Exactly. So we have much more accurate technology and, old military strategy. If you see paintings of, for example, the Napoleonic Wars, just involved a whole bunch of soldiers lining up and going toward each other. Well, when you've got soldiers in a line and very accurate weapons.
I never got why that ever made sense.
I am not sure I do either.
Yeah, I don't
consider
myself a great military strategist, but wearing these bright uniforms and marching in step, in these kind of
it does seem to make you a very good target.
Yes. But anyway, you have the rifle now, much more accurate, and you end up with scenes like this. But what was the outcome of at Antietam?
Well, there are two very major outcomes of Antietam, I would say. One, on the negative side for the North, is this is a battle that is widely photographed, as you can see. Matthew Brady, who was the leading photography studio owner of his time, and it's 1T.
Matthew, okay.
Yeah, very important, only 1T.
Yes, non-traditional spelling of Matthew.
Yes. He sends out his photographer that works for him named Alexander Gardner, and they have roving photographers for the first time. They have wagons, and they take...
Because photography is just becoming a used technology at this time.
And so they have Alexander Gardner photograph the battlefields at Antietam, and as you can see...
E.R.?
That's right, yes.
Gardner.
As you can see, this is just about as far away from the kind of heroic paintings of what battles looked like that people had been used to seeing up until this point. These don't look like, the sort of heroes of the Revolutionary War like George Washington. This is
gruesome.
This is gruesome.
This is really fascinating because we take it for granted in today's day and age, is that the effect of media on people's perception of things like war. Before the camera, before photographs, if I'm a civilian, I just hear about these, these great stories, and I see these paintings that look very valiant and very heroic. But now with photographs, you see the grim reality of war. I mean, people just shot in their tracks, and young men just, just piled up. It's just very dark, and a lot of the.
Yeah, and it's a real PR problem for the North, because this is before we can really put photography in newspapers. They don't have that technology yet. But these photographs were put on display in Brady's studios. He had one in Washington, D.C. and one in New York City. And people would go and look at these photographs, and it was very shocking to them. It was a level of detail that they had never seen. In some cases, they could make out the faces of the individual men who were dead on the battlefield. And that just seemed, beyond what was imaginable to these people, to think of some poor person going into one of these studios and seeing their son dead there on the battlefield made it very difficult for the North to keep up morale.
Fascinating.
So we've been talking about the progress of the American Civil War, which started in early 1861 after the 11 states of the South, which were slave states, seceded from the Union and tried to establish an independent nation known as the Confederate States of America. And in the first years of the Civil War, things went relatively well for the South. They defeated the North at the Battle of Bull Run, which was a great surprise to many people because they thought that this was going to be a pretty short war, that the South would be quickly defeated and scared away into returning to the Union. But the South had many advantages, including very good leadership in the person of Robert E. Lee, and also kind of a home court advantage at large, since the vast majority of the war was fought in the South. So in this early stage, the Confederacy does quite well until we get to Antietam. And Antietam was this first foray by Robert E. Lee in trying to attack the states of the North in Maryland. And after the Battle of Antietam, which was the bloodiest day in U.S. history, more than 4,000 Americans died on that day, the South was defeated. And that was a major turning point in the war, as we've talked about in previous videos, in that it led to the Emancipation Proclamation and was kind of the moment at which the nations of Europe ceased to consider intervening on the side of the South. So in the next few videos, I want to talk about the later stages of the Civil War. So we get into 1863, and the South is doing relatively well here in Virginia, wins the Battle of Chancellorsville, and now, nearly a year after Antietam, in June and July of 1863, Robert E. Lee decides that he is going to try again to invade the North. Now, he has several reasons for doing this. One is that the war has been taking place largely in the South. So it's summer, people are trying to harvest their crops, and Lee wants to give the South a break. So he wants to take the attention away from this area in Virginia where lots of fighting has happened, and he wants to take the war up into the North. And if the North is distracted by having to defend its own territory, then it can't go on the offensive elsewhere as easily. So Lee's plan is to take the war to the North. And Lee has another reason in his sleeve, which is that he is really hoping that in the election of 1864, which is coming up not too long after this period in mid-1863, many people believe that Lincoln is going to be kicked out of office. Now remember that not a single American president has been elected to a second term or re-elected since Andrew Jackson in 1832. So there's been a 30-year drought of two-term presidents. So Robert E. Lee has good reason to expect why Lincoln might not be re-elected in 1864, and he thinks that maybe one of Lincoln's competitors in the Democratic Party, which will turn out to be one of his own former generals, George B. McClellan, will actually want to end the war and make peace with the South. So there's kind of a morale aspect to this. You can see that many of the things done in the Civil War, and especially as we get into the later stages, are designed at making one side or the other tired of being at war. Now, you may wonder why I'm spending so much time talking about battles, because most American history courses do not emphasize military history whatsoever. But I think it's important to keep in mind in this war, and in some earlier wars like the American Revolution, the battles really determine the policy, right? Because you can't make a decree like the way that Abraham Lincoln decreed the Emancipation Proclamation if you don't have the force of military power behind you. So winning battles, winning the war, those kinds of victories give politicians the popular mandate they need to get things done. So that's why I think it's important to talk at least a little bit about the battles of the Civil War. Now, obviously, Bull Run, Antietam, Gettysburg, and Appomattox were not the only battles of the Civil War. There were hundreds of battles of the Civil War, but I've chosen these as particular turning points just to kind of give you a very brief overview of the way that military victories and defeats were trending, because along with those military victories and defeats went the policy of the United States and the policy of the South. And if you're interested in the Civil War, it's one of the most written about topics in American history, and there are many wonderful books that will go into great detail about the politics, society, and military history of the Civil War, and lots of great television shows and miniseries that I definitely suggest that you check out. All right, well, with that said, let's talk about Gettysburg. So Lee has brought his forces into the North, and again, he's interested in kind of distracting the North from attacking in the South by bringing the war to them. He's hoping to prolong the war so that perhaps another administration that's more favorable to allowing the South to go peacefully might be in office in the North. And the other thing that he's looking for is supplies. So once again, the vast majority of the Civil War has been fought in the South, and it's been fought here in this sort of Shenandoah Valley, Tidewater region of Virginia, which is really the breadbasket of the South. So when men are out fighting battles, and when battles are being fought on fields instead of crops being grown on them, there's going to be a serious dearth of food in the South. You know, I once heard it said that the most salient political fact of the 20th century was that the Americans speak English, which means that the United States repeatedly allied with Britain in 20th century wars. But if I had to choose the most salient fact of the American Civil War, it might be that you can't eat cotton. You know, the South went to war to protect its system of labor so that it could continue to produce these cash crops like cotton or tobacco. And cash crops they may be, which means that you can sell them for money, but you can't eat cotton or tobacco. And when it comes down to it, being able to feed your troops and feed your populace is something that's going to really help you when it comes to winning a war. So Lee is taking his troops up into the North, and he takes them into southern Pennsylvania, which is very lovely farmland. It's a very beautiful place. If you've never been there, I absolutely recommend you take a look. Go to Gettysburg. It's a very well-preserved battlefield. And as Lee goes through southern Pennsylvania, his troops are taking horses and grain supplies and all sorts of things that the army needs to survive, which are in short supply in Virginia. So this is like a run to the store for Lee going through southern Pennsylvania. On the northern side, General George Meade has been trying to catch up with Lee and cut him off from his invasion of the North. President Abraham Lincoln asks for many volunteers to try to stave off the invasion of the North by Lee, and they end up meeting at Gettysburg. And Gettysburg is just a small farm town in southern Pennsylvania. It's just where these two troops happened to meet as Lee was on his way to the capital of Pennsylvania, Harrisburg. And Lee's forces and Meade's forces meet on July 1st, 1863. Now, the Battle of Gettysburg goes on for 3 days. So there's July 1st, July 2nd, and July 3rd. And the first day goes relatively well for the Confederates. They break some of the Union lines around the edges. The second day is kind of a stalemate where Northern forces and Southern forces, they sustain a lot of losses, but don't make any real headway toward victory. And then the third day, Lee decides that he is going to try to break the center of the Union forces, which means that he is going to try to hit the Union line. And remember, this is in the era of military history where people are still kind of fighting in lines, right through the center, and win the day. Unfortunately for him, that is not what happens. So he tries all day to break the Union lines. There's a very famous sort of last hurrah for the Southern forces in this called Pickett's Charge, when General George Pickett's units charge up this hill at Cemetery Ridge trying to break the line, and they sustain over 50% casualties. So it's kind of a bloodbath for Pickett's unit. And after Pickett's charge does not succeed, the Union forces have officially won the Battle of Gettysburg. And Lee realizes that there's no way that he's going to be able to make anything out of his invasion of the North. And so he turns around and starts heading back to the South. Now, what's important about Gettysburg is that this was what many have called the high water mark of the Confederacy. And by that, they mean this is as far as the Confederacy ever managed to get into the northern part of the United States. This is a second attempt at an invasion by Lee, and it failed. And many people see this as a really important turning point in the Civil War. On July 4th, and imagine the good news of receiving word that your troops had triumphed on July 4th, Independence Day. President Lincoln and the United States get another really good piece of news, which is that Ulysses S. Grant, who will be the future commander of U.S. forces, has succeeded in his siege of Vicksburg, which is a town on the Mississippi River. And when he takes the town on the Mississippi River, Grant has complete control of the Mississippi, which is sort of the major highway in the West. So July 3rd and July 4th are really good days for the United States. And this is kind of the moment when it becomes clear that victory is going to be outside the reach of the Confederacy. And with an unsuccessful invasion of the North and the loss of the control of the Mississippi, the South's time is kind of coming to an end. The other important thing about the Battle of Gettysburg is that it is a tremendously destructive battle. About 50,000 casualties took place at Gettysburg, which makes it the single bloodiest battle in American history, which is different from the single bloodiest day, which was at Antietam, because it took place over 3 days. And this is not 50,000 people dying, just 50,000 casualties, which means either deaths or injuries. Those are men who can no longer fight on both sides. So the tremendous loss of life at Gettysburg is going to lead to the foundation of a cemetery at Gettysburg to bury these military dead. And it's going to be in November of 1863, just a couple months after the Battle of Gettysburg, that Abraham Lincoln will visit the cemetery at Gettysburg and deliver the Gettysburg Address, one of the most famous orations in all of American history. And we'll get to that in the next video. All right, so we've been talking about the later stages of the American Civil War. And in the last videos, we talked about the Battle of Gettysburg and the Gettysburg Address, which happened in November of 1863, as Abraham Lincoln went to the site of the Battle of Gettysburg to dedicate the cemetery that was being built there to hold the battlefield dead, which numbered in the thousands. So in the next few videos, I'd like to take you through the last stages of the Civil War, starting with late 1863. So if you think back to the very beginning of the war, the North's strategy was called the Anaconda Plan. And the anaconda is a kind of snake that squeezes its victims. And so the plan of the North was going to be to squeeze the South by completely surrounding it and then not allowing anything to get in or out. So the South would have no choice but to surrender as they ran out of supplies. And so the Anaconda Plan is going fairly well in this late period of the war. So now you recall that they were going to blockade the Atlantic Ocean so that the South couldn't ship any of its cotton or receive any supplies from Europe. So that's not happening. And to take control of the Mississippi River, which goes here. And so the other reason why Abraham Lincoln was so happy after the North won the Battle of Gettysburg is because Ulysses S. Grant had just taken Vicksburg, which meant that the Union had control of the Mississippi River. So you can see that the plan to surround the South is going pretty well. And this blockade extended all the way down around Florida. So the last real area here that the Union needs to control is this sort of middle region here. And you know that these are the border states, so there's still slavery allowed in places like Kentucky and Tennessee and Maryland. And another thing that's kind of hard to see from this map is that there are mountains here. This is the Appalachian Mountain Range. And so this is going to be a difficult area to strategize through. So thanks to this mountain range, there are two real main theaters of war during the Civil War. There's the Eastern Theater of the war, which is over here. And that includes a lot of the battles that are going to take place in this Shenandoah Valley area of Virginia and through Georgia. So kind of the Tidewater Piedmont region of the East is one of the main areas where battle takes place during the Civil War. But the other theater is this Western Theater, and that includes the Mississippi River and these key border states of Kentucky and Tennessee. So when last we left off with the Battle of Gettysburg, Robert E. Lee, who is the commander of the armies for the Confederacy, had made an attempt to invade the North and got as far as southern Pennsylvania, where the Union troops, led by General George Meade, turned the Confederates away, and so now they're headed back to Virginia. And there's going to be some really fierce fighting here in this northern part of Virginia known as the Wilderness Campaign, as Lee retreats to Richmond. So that's the Eastern Theater. And I'll draw the blue line that's going to be following them here as well. Now, in the Western Theater of the war, Ulysses S. Grant has just provided a major victory by taking Vicksburg and now controlling all of the Mississippi River. So Abraham Lincoln has been looking for a great general to lead his armies. Now, Lee has been the commander of the Confederate armies this entire time, but the Union Army has had a multitude of commanders, from Winfield Scott to George McClellan. But in Ulysses S. Grant, Lincoln finally finds his general. And so after the victory at the Siege of Vicksburg, Grant goes up into Tennessee and finally captures Tennessee. So he takes Chattanooga and firmly puts Tennessee in control of the Union. So look how well the Anaconda strategy is going now. We've got Tennessee. We're almost there. So after taking Chattanooga, Lincoln makes Grant the commander of all the Union armies. He is the general-in-chief. And it's going to be Grant who ultimately leads the Union to victory. And when he meets up with Lee, as he will do once he heads to Richmond and then later Appomattox, he's going to be the one who really ends the war by forcing Lee's surrender. But we'll get to that. All right, so that's 1863, the period at which Grant becomes commander of the armies. Lee is turned away from his second invasion of the North and flees to Richmond. And the stage is set for the final year and a little bit more of the war, which we'll get to in the next video. All right, so we've been talking about the later stages of the Civil War, and in the last video we just did a brief overview of the end of 1863, after the North has won the Battle of Gettysburg, and Lee has been turned around and sent back down to Richmond, where he will be encamped for some time, and Ulysses S. Grant not only takes control of the Mississippi River with the victory at Vicksburg, he also comes up into Tennessee, takes control of the state of Tennessee, and in return, Lincoln makes him general-in-chief of the Union armies. So now let's move on and talk about 1864 and Sherman's march to the sea and the election of 1864. Both would be very important to the United States' victory. All right, so let's take a look at our map again. Now, as we recall, Lee is here in Richmond, and Grant, who was in Tennessee, is now coming over to challenge Lee at the siege of Richmond. So Grant has crossed over from the Western theater of the war, where he's been pretty much the entire time, into the Eastern theater, and he's kind of going for the killing blow now. And you'll remember that thanks to the Anaconda strategy, the Union now has control of the entire area of the South through a blockade on this side, control of the Mississippi, and now control of Tennessee. So there's just this little area that's left. So now what happens? Well, one of Grant's generals who served under him in this Tennessee campaign is now going to turn his attentions to a massive campaign of total war in the South. So this is William Tecumseh Sherman. And Sherman's idea is that he is going to cut a swath through the South, and he is going to try to destroy the South's morale by not only trying to get rid of foodstuffs and interrupt supply lines, destroy infrastructure, burn houses. He's going to make things so bad on the home front that the Confederate soldiers who are fighting up here with Lee are going to get upset that their property and their families are not being protected at home. So he's trying to win a morale victory by making people in the South really tired of being at war, and also by making Lee's soldiers want to desert and come back and defend their home territory. So Sherman turns his troops toward Atlanta. And in September of 1864, Sherman takes Atlanta. Now, there's a very famous scene of this in Gone with the Wind, where you see Scarlett O'Hara looking out over, the many injured people in the city of Atlanta. That's Sherman's doing. But now let's turn our attention away from the military campaigns for a second and talk about the politics of 1864. Now, in 1864, it's an election year. It's been 4 years since Lincoln was elected in November of 1860, and so now Lincoln has to stand for re-election. And this is a really interesting election for lots of reasons. One is that it's the first election during wartime since 1812. So in the election of 1864, soldiers are going to cast their ballots, either by getting short leaves to go to the ballot box or by sending in their ballots by mail. Another thing that's really interesting about this is that Lincoln is not at all sure that he's going to win this election. In fact, many in his own party, the Republican Party, feel that he's been considerably too soft on the South, that his plans for reunification are not nearly punitive enough. There are many who want to replace Lincoln with a more radical candidate in 1864. That does not end up happening. But one interesting thing that does end up happening is to try to increase Lincoln's appeal. His running mate is Andrew Johnson. And Johnson was a slaveholder, believe it or not, from Tennessee. And the idea was that maybe Johnson could pick up some of the Democrats who might necessarily have voted for McClellan, and maybe he could pick up some of the border states, the same way that we often might choose a vice president today because they come from a crucial swing state. And this is going to be important later because after Lincoln is assassinated, Andrew Johnson will take over as president, and he is quite a different president than Lincoln might have been under the circumstances. Now, on the Democratic side, the candidate is George McClellan, and you might remember McClellan because he was one of the first commanders of the Union Army, and Lincoln sent him down for failing to really go after the enemy strongly in the early stages of the war. Now, the Democratic Party is having some internal struggles at this point. There are some who think that the war against the South is very foolish, that no one should be fighting in the North to end slavery, which Lincoln has clearly made a war goal by this point. And so many just wish to have peace with the South on the terms of the South, which is as a separate nation with the continuation of slavery. And then there are those Democrats who would like to continue the war, and McClellan ends up being one of those. Obviously, being a general, it would have been pretty difficult for him to say that the war was pointless without having disappointed so many people who had fought for him or with him. Now, this election is really crucial because many in the South are hoping that if someone other than Lincoln gets elected, if the Democrats are elected, that is going to be their last best hope to try to achieve their independence from the Union. I mean, if Lincoln is replaced by someone who is pro-South, who is pro-slavery, then perhaps they'll just end the war and that will be the end of it. So whites in the South are really holding on to the idea that Lincoln will be defeated in 1864. And there are a lot of reasons to think that Lincoln might have been defeated in this. Lincoln himself was not very sure that he would win this election. Remember that there has not been a single American president who has been reelected in more than 30 years. The last president to be reelected was Andrew Jackson in 1832. So re-election is a very unusual thing at this point. And McClellan was a very popular general. You know, he got popular because he was very keen to spare the lives of his soldiers, which is quite different than the approach that Ulysses S. Grant will end up taking at the end of the war. But there are several things that go in Lincoln's favor. One is the capture of Atlanta by Sherman in September, and some very good military victories also in this eastern theater of the war. So McClellan, who had hoped that the war was going badly, didn't have much on his side when it actually came to Election Day, because at that point, the war was going pretty well. Remember that Sherman is here in Atlanta, and Sherman is now going to pick up what is known as his March to the Sea, when he cuts a 60-mile-wide swath of destruction through Georgia. So things are looking pretty good for the United States at this point. And the turning point for Lincoln in this election is really the votes of the soldiers. And they have a really strong pro-Lincoln mandate. One of Lincoln's campaign slogans is "Vote as you shot." So Lincoln ends up trouncing McClellan in the election of 1864, and he really comes away with a strong mandate to finish the war, finish it with an unconditional surrender of the South and the end of slavery. And having triumphed in the election of 1864, Lincoln gets even more good news from Georgia, which is a telegram from General Sherman from the city of Savannah saying, "Mr. President, I wish to offer you the city of Savannah as a Christmas present." So on December 25th, 1864, Sherman's March to the Sea has concluded, and from there he's going to start heading north. And we'll get to that in the next video. So in the last video, we talked about the year 1864 in the American Civil War. And now we're getting down to the very end of the war. So in 1864, William Tecumseh Sherman had his sort of famous March to the Sea, where he captured Atlanta and then carried on a total war through the state of Georgia to Savannah. And from Savannah, he turns north and starts heading to the forces of Grant so he can back him up in a final victory against Lee, who has encamped in Richmond. Meanwhile, Abraham Lincoln wins the election of 1864 and is ready to bring this war to a close. So let's move on to 1865. A lot happens very quickly in 1865, starting with in January, Congress passed the 13th Amendment. Now, the 13th Amendment outlawed slavery for all time. So it's clear that when the South is brought back into the United States, it is going to be brought back in without slavery. There is no option for slavery in the United States going forward. Now, Grant, after his incredible victory in Tennessee, in Vicksburg, has been going after Lee's army in Virginia. Now, Lee has holed up in Richmond, and eventually he realizes his forces can't stay there anymore. They can't hold the city. So in the beginning of April, they evacuate Richmond, and on April 3rd, the United States forces occupy Richmond. And Abraham Lincoln himself actually goes down to visit Richmond, which he'd never been to before. And he even goes to the government building in Richmond where Confederate President Jefferson Davis had governed, and goes into his office. And he's there less than 48 hours after Davis himself had left. And then events take place very quickly. So Lee falls back from Richmond to Petersburg, and Grant is kind of marking him the whole time. And they retreat across Virginia to the west. Lee's probably heading for Lynchburg, and Grant manages to catch up with him at Appomattox. And at first, Lee thinks that he's actually going to fight at Appomattox, and then he realizes he just does not have the men necessary. So he invites Grant to come and have a parley for surrender, and they meet. This is actually a picture of Lee outside the house in Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, where he surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia to Grant. Now, that is not the actual end of the Civil War, but it's kind of the end for all intents and purposes, because Lee is the general-in-chief of the Confederate armies. Grant is likewise for the United States. And after this point, it's just going to be kind of a matter of time until all the rest of the Confederate armies surrender. So there's great celebration in Washington, D.C. Everyone is very happy. Finally, this 4-year-long war where 620,000 Americans have died is over, and Abraham Lincoln goes and gives a speech talking about what Reconstruction is going to be like. And in this speech, he lays out that African Americans after the Civil War are going to have citizenship, at least some of them, and the right to vote, which is in keeping with everything that he's really said since the Emancipation Proclamation. But what he does not know is that this man, John Wilkes Booth, is in the crowd that day listening to him. And when he hears Lincoln say that African Americans are going to have citizenship, they're going to have the right to vote, he vows to kill Lincoln. John Wilkes Booth is a really interesting character. We only know so much about him. He himself was a famous actor. In fact, Lincoln had seen him perform a number of times and liked him, even invited him to the White House because he thought he was a great actor, but Booth refused to go and see Lincoln. And he was from a family of famous actors. I think kind of a modern day equivalent might be the Sheen family. Booth had a famous brother who was also an actor, and a famous father who was also an actor, just like, Martin Sheen's sons are Emilio Estevez and Charlie Sheen today. So this would be like if Emilio Estevez or Charlie Sheen suddenly decided to murder the president, which would be a pretty incredibly big deal, just as it was then. Booth was a Confederate sympathizer and almost certainly a Confederate spy who had gone up to Canada at some time to plot some movement on behalf of the Confederacy. And he was an outright racist. I think the part where Lincoln said that African Americans would have citizenship was what pushed him over the edge into assassinating Lincoln. Originally, he had actually planned to kidnap Lincoln and ransom him for the end of the Civil War. But after Lee surrenders, Booth's plan changes. He wants to basically basically decapitate the government. So he conspires with a couple of other people, and they plan that they're going to kill all the highest people in government at once. So they're going to kill Lincoln, they're going to kill General Grant, they're going to kill William Seward, the Secretary of State, and they're going to kill Andrew Johnson, the vice president. And Booth thinks that perhaps in this moment of panic that follows the decapitation of the entire United States government, that perhaps something positive for the South will happen. Remember, they had hoped that getting rid of Lincoln in the election of 1864 might result in putting a government more favorable to the South in office in the North, which didn't happen, so perhaps Booth wants to do the same thing at this time. So Booth reads in the newspaper that Abraham Lincoln is going to be attending a play at Ford's Theater that evening. And Booth is a regular at Ford's Theater. In fact, he even has his mail delivered there. So it's kind of his home away from home. And when Booth goes to the theater with the intent to kill Lincoln, he pretty much just goes up to Lincoln's box and everyone knows who he is and they say, "Hi, John." And he just walks on by, walks right into Lincoln's box, shuts the door behind him and shoots Lincoln through the back of the head. At that point, he jumped on the stage from the booth, which is maybe 14 feet above the stage. If you've never been to Ford's Theater and you have an opportunity, I highly recommend you go. It's a really interesting museum and historical place. And in the process, he actually breaks his ankle. So in his running away, he's dealing with this broken ankle, and eventually he is captured and refuses to be taken alive. So he is killed. And then later, the rest of the conspirators are hanged for their participation in this plot. There's some confusion over what Booth said when he jumped out of the box. A lot of people say that he yelled "Sic semper tyrannis," which means "thus always to tyrants," and is also the motto of the state of Virginia. Other people heard him say things like "I've done it," or "revenge for the South," but "Sic semper tyrannis" is kind of the famous phrase that has come out of this. So Booth is calling Lincoln a tyrant, and that tyrants are eventually always assassinated. The rest of the assassination plot from that evening mostly failed. One of the conspirators, Lewis Powell, did manage to get into William Seward's house and stab him. He did not succeed in killing him, but he did wound Seward very badly. The rest of the assassination plots did not come to fruition whatsoever. Now, one thing you'll notice is that only a few parts of the Confederate Army have actually surrendered at the time of Lincoln's assassination. So the war is, in some cases, still ongoing, particularly in North Carolina, in Raleigh and Durham, where Sherman's forces have come up through South Carolina and North Carolina to meet the forces of Confederate General Joe Johnston. And it's on April the 26th that Joe Johnston surrenders to William Tecumseh Sherman. From that point forward, there are a few dribs and drabs of other armies that are still surrendering. Interesting fact, the last Confederate unit to surrender actually surrendered in November of 1865 in Liverpool, England. This was a Confederate ship that had been sailing around, and when they finally came into port, they officially surrendered. Now, after Lincoln's assassination, which was an incredible shock to the United States, remember that no president had ever been assassinated before, the power is then transferred to Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's vice president. And Johnson's presidency is going to end up being very problematic for a number of reasons, the most important of which being that he's very sympathetic to the South. And with Johnson in power as president, he's going to have a considerable amount of conflict with the American Congress, which is dominated by radical Republicans who think that Lincoln himself was not nearly punitive enough toward the South. There's going to be just an incredible battle of wills between Congress and Johnson that's going to end with Johnson being the first American president to be impeached. And so thus endeth the Civil War of the United States with the North victorious. The southern states come back into the Union. The rebellion in the South is defeated. Slavery has ended, and the era of states' rights is over. In the next video, I'd like to talk just for a few moments about the big takeaways about the American Civil War. What is it that makes it so important, and what were the lasting effects? I'll get to that in the next video. We've been discussing the American Civil War, which lasted from 1861 until 1865. It was the deadliest conflict in all of American history, in which about 620,000 Americans lost their lives. We briefly went over the very end of the war as Grant caught up to Lee at Appomattox and Lee surrendered, and then Confederate sympathizer and sometimes spy John Wilkes Booth assassinated American President Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was followed in office by Andrew Johnson, who will preside over Reconstruction. But now that we've talked about the progress of war, from the first fighting at Fort Sumter in April of 1861 to the last surrenders in November of 1865, I'd like to take just a few minutes to contemplate what some of the bigger issues that the Civil War raises are in American history, and what impact will it have on the future of American life. Well, certainly one of the most important things, if not the most important thing, to come out of the Civil War is the end of slavery. You know, before the Civil War, before the 1850s, your average white American who lived in, say, Pennsylvania or Kentucky probably wasn't very fond of slavery, but probably wouldn't have gone out of his or her way to take a stand against it. I think Lincoln himself was very representative of this view in that he hated slavery, but he thought that he had no right to interfere with it, and he mostly just wanted to make sure that slave owners couldn't bring enslaved people out west to take lands from what he saw as hardworking, deserving, poorer whites. By the end of the Civil War, no one could argue that African Americans, especially in the North, did not deserve citizenship. Throughout the Civil War, African Americans proved their importance to the nation time and time again, especially through their military service in units like the 54th Massachusetts, for example. And so for the approximately 4.5 million enslaved people who lived in the South, they now had their freedom. And the story of what happens to these people who have been freed from bondage is perhaps the most interesting and important story of American history. Does all men are created equal mean all men and women are created equal? That is the question that will occupy the nation in one way or another up until the present, really. Another major important takeaway from the Civil War is that the Civil War represented a movement in the United States from a union of states to a nation. And you can even see how Abraham Lincoln's thinking on this changes over the course of the war. He starts to even use the word nation more and more. Throughout the early part of the history of the United States, you see this balance of power between states and between the federal government really shifting all of the time. You see things like the nullification crisis in the 1830s when South Carolina said, we don't like this tariff. We think that as a state, the Union is composed out of the consent of the individual states, and therefore the state has the right to nullify a law it doesn't agree with. The same sort of situation happened in 1860 over slavery. The southern states believed that Lincoln would outlaw slavery and thought that it would be more important to secede as a group of states protecting, in their words, their states' rights than to be subject to the laws of of the nation. Well, the Civil War ends that kind of thinking. In fact, you even see it from how people write the name of this country. Frequently, it might have been said before the Civil War, these United States. Right? It's a group of states that are united. After the Civil War, it becomes the United States. One nation, indivisible. And so this is the moment when the federal government really begins to grow. During wartime, the North had to really organize as a nation to provide resources for their populace and for the soldiers. And so the president gained powers that he had never had before, and the federal bureaucracy itself grew a great deal. And you're going to see this throughout the 20th century, really up until the 1970s, that the federal government in the United States is going to have more and more power. A third important takeaway from the Civil War is that during the Civil War, the North industrialized to produce all of the goods and material that the North needed to succeed. They built factories and railroads, and those factories and railroads and all the rest of the impressive engineering that went into winning the war is then going to be turned toward making an industrial behemoth in the post-war era. So a lot of things that started during the Civil War in terms of national industrialization really carry on in the post-war era known as the Gilded Age, that help the United States become the world's premier industrial power, and later, based on that industrial power, one of the world's premier political powers. Another thing that is not often talked about with the Civil War is the growing role of women in the United States polity. In the American Civil War, at first, it was very taboo for a woman of good birth to go and become a nurse. But as the war progressed, that kind of Victorian thinking, believing that a woman belonged only to a very feminine and domestic sphere of life, really had to fade away in the face of the reality that women needed to play a role in the war. In the North, women became nurses. They helped to chair the American Sanitary Commission, which was one of the key hospital groups of the time period. And in the South, many women also really took over the running of family farms. As white men went away, white women, poorer white women, for example, would be in charge of a farm themselves. A white woman who belonged to a slave-owning family herself would then have charge of enslaved people. So women took a much more leading role during the Civil War. After the Civil War, some of that falls away. In fact, there's a really difficult moment in the movement for women's rights when, in 1870, the 15th Amendment granted African American men the right to vote, but not women. And so the women's movement will take some time to regroup in the late 19th century. But the Civil War, like many later wars, brought women outside the home. And after the war, they were not anxious to go back there. They became involved in many charitable organizations, often known as social housekeeping, as women do more and more things outside the home, which will eventually grow into the women's movement of the early 20th century and lead to women getting the right to vote. This is just a small sampling of some of the major impacts that the Civil War had on the United States. Often when we think about United States history, we think about it cutting off at the Civil War. Most college courses or high school courses are organized the U.S. before the Civil War and the U.S. after the Civil War, because it's a really defining moment in our nation's history for these reasons and for many others. The United States entered the Civil War a loose union of states divided by territory and beliefs, and exited the Civil War a single nation, modern, industrial, peopled by an incredibly diverse range of citizens from all over the world. In other words, after the Civil War, the United States will really come into its own. And that's because the Civil War was the moment when the United States grew up. The United States in 1870 looked a lot more like the year 1900 than it did the year 1860. The 13th Amendment and later the 14th and 15th Amendments ruled that people of African descent were citizens of the United States. Remember, beforehand, enslaved people in the South counted for only 3/5 of a person, and that person couldn't vote, move freely, or own his or her own labor, not to mention their own life. The Civil War decided once and for all that everyone born in the United States was a United States citizen. But what citizenship really meant for African Americans, for women, for Native Americans and immigrants, even for whites, was still something that would be hammered out through the rest of the 19th century and the 20th. After the Civil War, the old problems of sectional tension and states' rights were put to rest, but they were replaced by new problems of modern America, industrialization, poverty, immigration. And so, as the guns of the Civil War fell quiet, the United States embarked into a new era, the Gilded Age.